Chapter 1 of Prester John. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Prester John by John Buchan. Chapter 1. The Man on the Kirkcaple Shore. I mind as if it were yesterday my first sight of the man. Little I knew at the time how big the moment was with destiny, or how often that face, seen in the fitful moonlight, would haunt my sleep and disturb my waking hours. But I mind yet the cold grue of terror I got from it, a terror which was surely more than the due of a few truant lads breaking the Sabbath with their play. The town of Kirkcaple, of which and its adjacent parish of Portincross my father was the minister, lies on a hillside above the little bay of Caple, and looks squarely out on the North Sea. Round the horns of land which enclose the bay, the coast shows on either side a battlement of stark red cliffs, through which a burn or two makes a pass to the water's edge. The bay itself is ringed with fine clean sands, where we lads of the burgh school loved to bathe in the warm weather. But on long holidays the sport was to go farther afield among the cliffs, for there were many deep caves and pools, where podleys might be caught with a line, and hid treasure sought for at the expense of the skin of the knees and the buttons of the trousers. Many a long Saturday I have passed in a crinkle of the cliffs, having lit a fire of driftwood, and made believe that I was a smuggler or a Jacobite new landed from France. There was a band of us in Kirkcaple, lads of my own age, including Archie Leslie, the son of my father's session clerk, and Tam Dyke, the provost's nephew. We were sealed to silence by the blood oath, and we bore each the name of some historic pirate or sailor-man. I was Paul Jones, Tam was Captain Kidd, and Archie, need I say it, was Morgan himself. Our tryst was a cave where a little water, called the Dive Burn, had cut its way through the cliffs to the sea. There we foregathered in the summer evenings, and of a Saturday afternoon in winter, and told mighty tales of our prowess, and flattered our silly hearts. But the sober truth is that our deeds were of the humblest, and a dozen of fish or a handful of apples was all our booty, and our greatest exploit a fight with the roughs at the Dive tan work. My father's spring communion fell on the last Sabbath of April, and on the particular Sabbath of which I speak, the weather was mild and bright for the time of year. I had been surfeited with the Thursdays and Saturdays services, and the 2 long diets of worship on the Sabbath were hard for a lad of 12 to bear with the spring in his bones and the sun slanting through the gallery window. There still remained the service on the Sabbath evening, a doleful prospect, for the Reverend Mr. Murdoch of Kilchristie, noted for the length of his discourses, had exchanged pulpits with my father, so my mind was ripe for the proposal of Archie Leslie on our way home to tea, that by a little skill we might give the kirk the slip. At our communion the pews were emptied of their regular occupants, and the congregation seated itself as it pleased. The manse seat was full of the Kirkcaple relations of Mr. Murdoch, who had been invited there by my mother to hear him, and it was not hard to obtain permission to sit with Archie and Tam Dyke in the cockloft in the gallery. Word was sent to Tam, and so it happened that 3 abandoned lads duly passed the plate and took their seats in the cockloft. But when the bell was done jowing, and we heard by the sounds of their feet that the elders had gone into the kirk, we slipped down the stairs and out of the side door. We were through the churchyard in a twinkling, and hot foot on the road to the Dive Burn. It was the fashion of the genteel in Kirkcaple to put their boys into what were known as Eton suits, long trousers, cut-away jackets, and chimney-pot hats. I had been one of the earliest victims, and well I remember how I fled home from the Sabbath school with the snowballs of the town roughs rattling off my chimney-pot. Archie had followed, his family being in all things imitators of mine, We were now clothed in this wearisome garb, so our first care was to secrete safely our hats in a marked spot under some whin bushes on the links. Tam was free from the bondage of fashion, and wore his ordinary best knickerbockers. From inside his jacket he unfolded his special treasure, which was to light us on our expedition, an evil-smelling old tin lantern with a shutter. Tam was of the Free Kirk persuasion, and as his communion fell on a different day from ours, he was spared the bondage of church attendance from which Archie and I had revolted. But notable events had happened that day in his church. A black man, the Reverend John something or other, had been preaching. Tam was full of the portent. A nigger, he said, a great black chap as big as your father, Archie. He seemed to have banged the book-board with some effect, and had kept Tam for once in his life awake. He had preached about the heathen in Africa, and how a black man was as good as a white man in the sight of God, and he had forecast a day when the Negroes would have something to teach the British in the way of civilization. So, at any rate, ran the account of Tam Dyke, who did not share the preacher's views. "It's all nonsense, Davy. The Bible says that the children of Ham were to be our servants. If I were the minister, I wouldn't let a nigger into the pulpit. I wouldn't let him farther than the Sabbath school." Night fell as we came to the broomy spaces of the links, and ere we had breasted the slope of the neck which separates Kirkcaple Bay from the cliffs, it was as dark as an April evening with a full moon can be. Tam would have had it darker. He got out his lantern, and after a prodigious waste of matches, kindled the candle end inside, turned the dark shutter, and trotted happily on. We had no need of his lighting till the Dive Burn was reached, and the path began to descend steeply through the rift in the crags. It was here that we found that someone had gone before us. Archie was great in those days at tracking, his ambition running in Indian paths. He would walk always with his head bent and his eyes on the ground, whereby he several times found lost coins, and once a trinket dropped by the provost's wife. At the edge of the burn, where the path turns downward, there is a patch of shingle washed up by some spate. Archie was on his knees in a second. "Lads," he cried, "there's spoor here." And then after some nosing, "It's a man's track, going downward, a big man with flat feet. It's fresh too, for it crosses the damp bit of gravel, and the water has scarcely filled the holes yet." We did not dare to question Archie's woodcraft, but it puzzled us who the stranger could be. In summer weather you might find a party of picnickers here, attracted by the fine hard sands at the burn mouth. But at this time of night and season of the year there was no call for anyone to be trespassing on our preserves. No fishermen came this way, the lobster pots being all to the east, and the stark headland of the Red Neb made the road to them by the water's edge difficult. The tan work lads used to come now and then for a swim, but you would not find a tan work lad bathing on a chill April night. Yet there was no question where our precursor had gone. He was making for the shore. Tam unshuttered his lantern, and the steps went clearly down the corkscrew path. "Maybe he is after our cave. We'd better go cannily." The glim was doused. The words were Archie's, and in the best contraband manner we stole down the gully. The business had suddenly taken an eerie turn, and I think in our hearts we were all a little afraid. But Tam had a lantern, and it would never do to turn back from an adventure which had all the appearance of being the true sort. Halfway down there is a scrog of wood, dwarf alders and hawthorn, which makes an arch over the path. I for one was glad when we got through this with no worse mishap than a stumble from Tam, which caused the lantern door to fly open and the candle to go out. We did not stop to relight it, but scrambled down the screes till we came to the long slabs of reddish rock which abutted on the beach. We could not see the track, so we gave up the business of scouts, and dropped quietly over the big boulder and into the crinkle of cliff which we called our cave. There was nobody there, so we relit the lantern and examined our properties. 2 or 3 fishing rods for the burn, much damaged by weather, some sea lines on a dry shelf of rock, a couple of wooden boxes, a pile of driftwood for fires, and a heap of quartz in which we thought we had found veins of gold. Such was the modest furnishing of our den. To this I must add some broken clay pipes, with which we made believe to imitate our elders, smoking a foul mixture of coltsfoot leaves and brown paper. The band was in session, so following our ritual we sent out a picket. Tam was deputed to go round the edge of the cliff from which the shore was visible, and report if the coast was clear. He returned in 3 minutes, his eyes round with amazement in the lantern light. "There's a fire on the sands," he repeated, "and a man beside it." Here was news indeed. Without a word we made for the open, Archie first, and Tam, who had seized and shuttered his lantern, coming last. We crawled to the edge of the cliff and peered round, and there, sure enough on the hard bit of sand which the tide had left by the burn mouth, was a twinkle of light and a dark figure. The moon was rising, and besides there was that curious sheen from the sea which you will often notice in spring. The glow was maybe 100 yards distant, a little spark of fire I could have put in my cap, and from its crackling and smoke, composed of dry seaweed and half-green branches from the burnside thickets, a man's figure stood near it, and as we looked it moved round and round the fire in circles, which first of all widened and then contracted. The sight was so unexpected, so beyond the beat of our experience, that we were all a little scared. What could this strange being want with a fire at 8:30 of an April Sabbath night on the Dyveburn sands? We discussed the thing in whispers behind a boulder, but none of us had any solution. "Belike he's come ashore in a boat," said Archie. "He's maybe a foreigner." But I pointed out that, from the tracks which Archie himself had found, the man must have come overland down the cliffs. Tam was clear he was a madman, and was for withdrawing promptly from the whole business. But some spell kept our feet tied there in that silent world of sand and moon and sea. I remember looking back and seeing the solemn, frowning faces of the cliffs, and feeling somehow shut in with this unknown being in a strange union. What kind of chance had brought this interloper into our territory? For a wonder, I was less afraid than curious. I wanted to get to the heart of the matter, and to discover what the man was up to with his fire and his circles. The same thought must have been in Archie's head, for he dropped on his belly and began to crawl softly seawards. I followed, and Tam, with sundry complaints, crept after my heels. Between the cliffs and the fire lay some 60 yards of debris and boulders, above the level of all but the high spring tides. Beyond lay a string of seaweedy pools, and then the hard sands of the Burnfoot. There was excellent cover among the big stones, and apart from the distance and the dim light, the man by the fire was too preoccupied in his task to keep much lookout towards the land. I remember thinking he had chosen his place well, for save from the sea he could not be seen. The cliffs are so undercut that unless a watcher on the coast were on their extreme edge, he would not see the Burnfoot sands. Archie, the skilled tracker, was the one who all but betrayed us. His knee slipped on the seaweed and he rolled off a boulder, bringing down with him a clatter of small stones. We lay as still as mice, in terror lest the man should have heard the noise and have come to look for the cause. By and by, when I ventured to raise my head above a flat-topped stone, I saw that he was undisturbed. The fire still burned, and he was pacing round it. Just on the edge of the pools was an outcrop of red sandstone, much fissured by the sea. Here was an excellent vantage ground, and all 3 of us curled behind it, with our eyes just over the edge. The man was not 20 yards off, and I could see clearly what manner of fellow he was. For one thing, he was huge of size, or so he seemed to me in the half light. He wore nothing but a shirt and trousers, and I could hear by the flap of his feet on the sand that he was barefoot. Suddenly Tam Dyke gave a gasp of astonishment. "Gosh, it's the Black Minister," he said. It was indeed a black man, as we saw when the moon came out of a cloud. His head was on his breast, and he walked round the fire with measured, regular steps. At intervals he would stop and raise both hands to the sky, and bend his body in the direction of the moon, but he never uttered a word. "It's magic," said Archie. "He's going to raise Satan. We must bide here and see what happens, for he'll grip us if we try to go back. The moon's o'er high." The procession continued as if to some slow music. I had been in no fear of the adventure back there by our cave, but now that I saw the thing from close at hand, my courage began to ebb. There was something desperately uncanny about this great Negro, who had shed his clerical garments and was now practising some strange magic alone by the sea. I had no doubt it was the black art, for there was that in the air and the scene which spelled the unlawful. As we watched, the circles stopped, and the man threw something on the fire. A thick smoke rose of which we could feel the aromatic scent, and when it was gone the flame burned with a silvery blueness like moonlight. Still no sound came from the minister, but he took something from his belt and began to make odd markings in the sand between the inner circle and the fire. As he turned, the moon gleamed on the implement, and we saw it was a great knife. We were now scared in real earnest. Here we were, 3 boys, at night in a lonely place a few yards from a great savage with a knife. The adventure was far past my liking, and even the intrepid Archie was having qualms, if I could judge from his set face. As for Tam, his teeth were chattering like a threshing mill. Suddenly I felt something soft and warm on the rock at my right hand. I felt again, and lo, it was the man's clothes. There were his boots and socks, his minister's coat, and his minister's hat. This made the predicament worse, for if we waited till he finished his rites, we should for certain be found by him. At the same time, to return over the boulders in the bright moonlight seemed an equally sure way to discovery. I whispered to Archie, who was for waiting a little longer. "Something may turn up," he said. It was always his way. I do not know what would have turned up, for we had no chance of testing it. The situation had proved too much for the nerves of Tam Dyke. As the man turned towards us in his bowings and bendings, Tam suddenly sprang to his feet and shouted at him a piece of schoolboy rudeness, then fashionable in Kirkcaple. "Walk hauled ye partin face, my bonny man." Then clutching his lantern he ran for dear life, while Archie and I raced at his heels. As I turned I had a glimpse of a huge figure, knife in hand, bounding towards us. Though I only saw it in the turn of a head, the face stamped itself indelibly upon my mind. It was black, black as ebony, but it was different from the ordinary Negro. There were no thick lips and flat nostrils. Rather, if I could trust my eyes, the nose was high bridged, and the lines of the mouth sharp and firm, but it was distorted into an expression of such terror and devilish fury and amazement that my heart became like water. We had a start, as I have said, of some 20 or 30 yards. Among the boulders we were not at a great disadvantage, for a boy can flit quickly over them, while a grown man must pick his way. Archie, as ever, kept his wits the best of us. "Make straight for the burn," he shouted in a hoarse whisper. "We'll beat him on the slope." We passed the boulders and slithered over the outcrop of red rock and the patches of sea pink, till we reached the channel of the dive water, which flows gently among pebbles after leaving the gully. Here for the first time I looked back and saw nothing. I stopped involuntarily, and that halt was nearly my undoing, for our pursuer had reached the burn before us, but lower down, and was coming up its bank to cut us off. At most times I am a notable coward, and in these days I was still more of one, owing to a quick and easily heated imagination. But now I think I did a brave thing, though more by instinct than resolution. Archie was running first, and had already splashed through the burn. Tam came next, just about to cross, and the black man was almost at his elbow. Another second and Tam would have been in his clutches had I not yelled out a warning and made straight up the bank of the burn. Tam fell into the pool. I could hear his spluttering cry, but he got across, for I heard Archie call to him, and the two vanished into the thicket which clothes all the left bank of the gully. The pursuer, seeing me on his side of the water, followed straight on, and before I knew, it had become a race between the two of us. I was hideously frightened, but not without hope, for the screes and shelves of this right side of the gully were known to me from many a day's exploring. I was light on my feet, and uncommonly sound in wind, being by far the best long-distance runner in Kirkcaple. If I could only keep my lead till I reached a certain corner I knew of, I could outwit my enemy, for it was possible from that place to make a detour behind a waterfall and get into a secret path of ours among the bushes. I flew up the steep screes, not daring to look round, but at the top, where the rocks begin, I had a glimpse of my pursuer. The man could run. Heavy in build though he was not 6 yards behind me, and I could see the white of his eyes and the red of his gums. I saw something else, a glint of white metal in his hand. He still had his knife. Fear sent me up the rocks like a seagull, and I scrambled and leaped, making for the corner I knew of. Something told me that the pursuit was slackening, and for a moment I halted to look round. A second time a halt was nearly the end of me. A great stone flew through the air, and took the cliff an inch from my head, half blinding me with splinters. And now I began to get angry. I pulled myself into cover, skirted a rock, till I came to my corner, and looked back for the enemy. There he was, scrambling by the way I had come, and making a prodigious clatter among the stones. I picked up a loose bit of rock and hurled it with all my force in his direction. It broke before it reached him, but a considerable lump, to my joy, took him full in the face. Then my terrors revived. I slipped behind the waterfall, and was soon in the thicket, and toiling towards the top. I think this last bit was the worst in the race, for my strength was failing, and I seemed to hear those horrid steps at my heels. My heart was in my mouth. As careless of my best clothes, I tore through the hawthorn bushes. Then I struck the path, and, to my relief, came on Archie and Tam, who were running slowly in desperate anxiety about my fate. We then took hands, and soon reached the top of the gully. For a second we looked back. The pursuit had ceased, and far down the burn we could hear the sounds as of someone going back to the sands. "Your face is bleeding, Davy. Did he get near enough to hit you?" Archie asked. "He hit me with a stone, but I gave him better. He's got a bleeding nose to remember this night by." We did not dare take the road by the links, but made for the nearest human habitation. This was a farm about half a mile inland, and when we reached it we lay down by the stackyard gate and panted. "I've lost my lantern," said Tam, "the big black brute. See if I don't tell my father." "Ye'll do nothing of the kind," said Archie fiercely. "He knows nothing about us and can't do us any harm. But if the story got out and he found out who we were, he'd murder the lot of us." He made us swear secrecy, which we were willing enough to do, seeing very clearly the sense in his argument. Then we found the high road and trotted back at our best pace to Kirkcaple, fear of our families gradually ousting fear of pursuit. In our excitement, Archie and I forgot about our Sabbath hats, reposing quietly below a whinbush on the links. We were not destined to escape without detection. As ill luck would have it, Mr. Murdoch had been taken ill with the stomachache after the second psalm, and the congregation had been abruptly dispersed. My mother had waited for me at the church door, and seeing no sign of her son, had searched the gallery. Then the truth came out, and had I been only for a mild walk on the links, retribution would have overtaken my truancy. But to add to this, I arrived home with a scratched face, no hat, and several rents in my best trousers. I was well cuffed and sent to bed, with the promise of full dress chastisement when my father should come home in the morning. My father arrived before breakfast next day, and I was duly and soundly whipped. I set out for school with aching bones to add to the usual depression of Monday morning. At the corner of the Nethergate I fell in with Archie, who was staring at a trap carrying two men which was coming down the street. It was the Free Church minister. He had married a rich wife and kept a horse, driving the preacher of yesterday to the railway station. Archie and I were in behind a doorpost in a twinkling, so that we could see in safety the last of our enemy. He was dressed in minister's clothes, with a heavy fur coat and a brand new yellow leather Gladstone bag. He was talking loudly as he passed, and the Free Church minister seemed to be listening attentively. I heard his deep voice saying something about the work of God in this place, but what I noticed specially, and the sight made me forget my aching hinder parts, was that he had a swollen eye and 2 strips of sticking plaster on his cheek. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Prester John. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prester John by John Buchan. Chapter 2. Firth, Fortune. In this plain story of mine there will be so many wild doings ere the end is reached, that I beg my reader's assent to a prosaic digression. I will tell briefly the things which happened between my sight of the man on the Kirkcaple sands and my voyage to Africa. I continued for 3 years at the Burgh School, where my progress was less notable in my studies than in my sports. One by one I saw my companions pass out of idle boyhood and be set to professions. Tam Dyke on 2 occasions ran off to sea in the Dutch schooners which used to load with coal in our port, and finally his father gave him his will, and he was apprenticed to the merchant service. Archie Leslie, who was a year my elder, was destined for the law, so he left Kirkcaple for an Edinburgh office, where he was also to take out classes at the college. I remained on at school till I sat alone by myself in the highest class, a position of little dignity and deep loneliness. I had grown a tall, square-set lad, and my prowess at rugby football was renowned beyond the parishes of Kirkcaple and Portincross. To my father I fear I was a disappointment. He had hoped for something in his son more bookish and sedentary, more like his gentle, studious self. On one thing I was determined. I should follow a learned profession. The fear of being sent to an office, like so many of my schoolfellows, inspired me to the little progress I ever made in my studies. I chose the ministry, not, I fear, out of any reverence for the sacred calling, but because my father had followed it before me. Accordingly I was sent at the age of 16 for a year's finishing at the High School of Edinburgh, and the following winter began my arts course at the university. If fate had been kinder to me, I think I might have become a scholar. At any rate, I was just acquiring a taste for philosophy and the dead languages, when my father died suddenly of a paralytic shock, and I had to set about earning a living. My mother was left badly off, for my poor father had never been able to save much from his modest stipend. When all things were settled, it turned out that she might reckon on an income of about £50 a year. This was not enough to live on, however modest the household, and certainly not enough to pay for the colleging of a son. At this point an uncle of hers stepped forward with a proposal. He was a well-to-do bachelor, alone in the world, and he invited my mother to live with him and take care of his house. For myself he proposed a post in some mercantile concern, for he had much influence in the circles of commerce. There was nothing for it but to accept gratefully. We sold our few household goods and moved to his gloomy house in Dundas Street. A few days later he announced at dinner that he had found for me a chance which might lead to better things. "You see, Davy," he explained, "you don't know the rudiments of business life. There's no house in the country that would take you in except as a common clerk, and you would never earn much more than £100 a year all your days. If you want to better your future, you must go abroad, where white men are at a premium. By the mercy of Providence, I met yesterday an old friend, Thomas Mackenzie, who was seeing his lawyer about an estate he is bidding for. He is the head of one of the biggest trading and shipping concerns in the world, Mackenzie, Muir and Oldmeadows. You may have heard the name. Among other things, he has half the stores in South Africa, where they sell everything from Bibles to fishhooks. Apparently they like men from home to manage the stores, and to make a long story short, when I put your case to him, he promised you a place. I had a wire from him this morning confirming the offer. You are to be assistant storekeeper at—" My uncle fumbled in his pocket, and then read from the yellow slip, "at Blaauwildebeestefontein. There's a mouthful for you." In this homely way I first heard of a place which was to be the theatre of so many strange doings. "It's a fine chance for you," my uncle continued. "You'll only be assistant at first, but when you have learned your job you'll have a store of your own. Mackenzie's people will pay you £300 a year, and when you get a store you'll get a percentage on sales. It lies with you to open up new trade among the natives. I hear that Blaau something or other is in the far north of the Transvaal, and I see from the map that it is in a wild, hilly country. You may find gold or diamonds up there, and come back and buy up Portincross House." My uncle rubbed his hands and smiled cheerily. Truth to tell, I was both pleased and sad. If a learned profession was denied me, I vastly preferred a Veld store to an Edinburgh office stool. Had I not been still under the shadow of my father's death, I might have welcomed the chance of new lands and new folk. As it was, I felt the loneliness of an exile. That afternoon I walked on the Braid Hills, and when I saw in the clear spring sunlight the coast of Fife, and remembered Kirkcaple and my boyish days, I could have found it in me to sit down and cry. A fortnight later I sailed. My mother bade me a tearful farewell, and my uncle, besides buying me an outfit and paying my passage money, gave me a present of 20 sovereigns. "You'll not be your mother's son, Davy," were his last words, "if you don't come home with it multiplied by 1,000. I thought at the time that I would give more than £20,000 to be allowed to bide on the windy shores of Firth. I sailed from Southampton by an intermediate steamer, and went steerage to save expense. Happily my acute homesickness was soon forgotten in another kind of malady. It blew half a gale before we were out of the Channel, and by the time we had rounded Ushant it was as dirty weather as ever I hoped to see. I lay mortal sick in my bunk, unable to bear the thought of food, and too feeble to lift my head. I wished I had never left home, but so acute was my sickness that if someone had there and then offered me a passage back or an immediate landing on shore, I should have chosen the latter. It was not till we got into the fair weather seas around Madeira that I recovered enough to sit on deck and observe my fellow passengers. There were some 50 of us in the steerage, mostly wives and children going to join relations, with a few emigrant artisans and farmers. I early found a friend in a little man with a yellow beard and spectacles, who sat down beside me and remarked on the weather in a strong Scotch accent. He turned out to be a Mr. Wardlaw from Aberdeen, who was going out to be a schoolmaster. He was a man of good education, who had taken a university degree, and had taught for some years as an undermaster in a school in his native town. But the east winds had damaged his lungs, and he had been glad to take the chance of a poorly paid country school in the veld. When I asked him where he was going, I was amazed to be told Blaauwildebeestefontein. Mr. Wardlaw was a pleasant little man with a sharp tongue but a cheerful temper. He laboured all day at primers of the Dutch and Kaffir tongues, but in the evening after supper he would walk with me on the after deck and discuss the future. Like me, he knew nothing of the land he was going to, but he was insatiably curious, and he affected me with his interest. "This place, Blaauwildebeestefontein," he used to say, "is among the Zoutpansberg mountains, and as far as I can see, not above 90 miles from the railroad. It looks from the map a well-watered country, and the agent general in London told me it was healthy, or I wouldn't have taken the job. It seems we'll be in the heart of native reserves up there, for here's a list of chiefs: Mpefu, Sikatola, Majinja, Magata, and there are no white men living to the east of us because of the fever. The name means the spring of the blue wildebeeste, whatever fearsome animal that may be." "It sounds like a place for adventure, Mr. Crawfurd. You'll exploit the pockets of the black men, and I'll see what I can do with their minds." There was another steerage passenger whom I could not help observing because of my dislike of his appearance. He too was a little man, by name Henriques, and in looks the most atrocious villain I have ever clapped eyes on. He had a face the colour of French mustard, a sort of dirty green, and bloodshot beady eyes with the whites all yellowed with fever. He had waxed moustaches, and a curious furtive way of walking and looking about him. We of the steerage were careless in our dress, but he was always clad in immaculate white linen, with pointed yellow shoes to match his complexion. He spoke to no one, but smoked long cheroots all day in the stern of the ship, and studied a greasy pocket-book. Once I tripped over him in the dark, and he turned on me with a snarl and an oath. I was short enough with him in return, and he looked as if he could knife me. "I'll wager that fellow has been a slave driver in his time," I told Mr. Wardlaw, who said, "God pity his slaves then." And now I come to the incident which made the rest of the voyage pass all too soon for me, and foreshadowed the strange events which were to come. It was the day after we crossed the line, and the first-class passengers were having deck sports. A tug of war had been arranged between the three classes, and a half-dozen of the heaviest fellows in the steerage, myself included, were invited to join. It was a blazing hot afternoon, but on the saloon deck there were awnings and a cool wind blowing from the bows. The first class beat the second easily, and after a tremendous struggle beat the steerage also. Then they regaled us with iced drinks and cigars to celebrate the victory. I was standing at the edge of the crowd of spectators when my eye caught a figure which seemed to have little interest in our games. A large man in clerical clothes was sitting on a deck chair reading a book. There was nothing novel about the stranger, and I cannot explain the impulse which made me wish to see his face. I moved a few steps up the deck, and then I saw that his skin was black. I went a little further, and suddenly he raised his eyes from his book and looked around. It was the face of the man who had terrified me years ago on the Kirkcaple shore. I spent the rest of the day in a brown study. It was clear to me that some destiny had prearranged this meeting. Here was this man travelling prosperously as a first-class passenger, with all the appurtenances of respectability. I alone had seen him invoking strange gods in the moonlight. I alone knew of the devilry in his heart, and I could not but believe that some day or other there might be virtue in that knowledge. The second engineer and I had made friends, so I got him to consult the purser's list for the name of my acquaintance. He was down as the Reverend John Laputa, and his destination was Durban. The next day being Sunday, who should appear to address us steerage passengers but the black minister? He was introduced by the captain himself, a notably pious man, who spoke of the labours of his brother in the dark places of heathendom. Some of us were hurt in our pride in being made the target of a black man's oratory, especially Mr. Henriques, whose skin spoke of the tar-brush, protested with oaths against the insult. Finally he sat down on a coil of rope and spat scornfully in the vicinity of the preacher. For myself, I was intensely curious, and not a little impressed. The man's face was as commanding as his figure, and his voice was the most wonderful thing that ever came out of human mouth. It was full and rich and gentle, with the tones of a great organ. He had none of the squat and preposterous negro lineaments, but a hawk nose like an Arab, dark flashing eyes, and a cruel and resolute mouth. He was black as my hat, but for the rest he might have sat for a figure of a crusader. I do not know what the sermon was about, though others told me that it was excellent. All the time I watched him and kept saying to myself, "You hunted me up the Dive Burn, and I bashed your face for you." Indeed, I thought I could see faint scars on his cheek. The following night I had a toothache, and could not sleep. It was too hot to breathe under cover, so I got up, lit a pipe, and walked on the afterdeck to ease the pain. The air was very still, save for the whish of water from the screws and the steady beat of the engines. Above, a great yellow moon looked down on me, and a host of pale stars. The moonlight set me remembering the old affair of the Dive Burn, and my mind began to run on the Reverend John Laputa. It pleased me to think that I was on the track of some mystery of which I alone had the clue. I promised myself to search out the antecedents of the minister when I got to Durban, for I had a married cousin there who might know something of his doings. Then, as I passed by the companionway to the lower deck, I heard voices, and peeping over the rail, I saw two men sitting in the shadow just beyond the hatch of the hold. I thought they might be two of the sailors seeking coolness on the open deck, when something in the figure of one of them made me look again. The next second I had slipped back and stolen across the afterdeck to a point just above them, for the two were the black minister and that ugly yellow villain Henriques. I had no scruples about eavesdropping, but I could make nothing of their talk. They spoke low, and in some tongue which may have been Kaffir or Portuguese, but was in any case unknown to me. I lay cramped and eager for many minutes, and was just getting sick of it when a familiar name caught my ear. Henriques said something in which I caught the word Blaauwildebeestefontein. I listened intently, and there could be no mistake. The minister repeated the name, and for the next few minutes it recurred often in their talk. I went back stealthily to bed, having something to make me forget my aching tooth. First of all, Laputa and Henriques were allies. Second, the place I was bound for had something to do with their schemes. I said nothing to Mr. Wardlaw, but spent the next week in the assiduous toil of the amateur detective. I procured some maps and books from my friend, the second engineer, and read all I could about Blaauwildebeestefontein. Not that there was much to learn, but I remember I had quite a thrill when I discovered from the chart of the ship's run one day that we were in the same latitude as that uncouthly named spot. I found out nothing, however, about Henriques or the Reverend John Laputa. The Portuguese still smoked in the stern and thumbed his greasy notebook. The minister sat in his deck chair and read heavy volumes from the ship's library. Though I watched every night, I never found them again together. At Cape Town, Henriques went ashore and did not return. The minister did not budge from the ship the 3 days we lay in port, and indeed it seemed to me that he kept his cabin. At any rate, I did not see his great figure on deck till we were tossing in the choppy seas round Cape Agulhas. Seasickness again attacked me, and with short lulls during our stoppages at Port Elizabeth and East London, I lay wretchedly in my bunk till we sighted the bluffs of Durban harbour. Here it was necessary for me to change my ship, for in the interests of economy I was going by sea to Delagoa Bay, and thence by the cheap railway journey into the Transvaal. I sought out my cousin, who lived in a fine house on the Berea, and found a comfortable lodging for the 3 days of my stay there. I made inquiries about Mr. Laputa, but could hear nothing. There was no native minister of that name, said my cousin, who was a great authority on all native questions. I described the man, but got no further light. No one had seen or heard of such a being, unless, said my cousin, he is one of those American Ethiopian rascals. My second task was to see the Durban manager of the firm which I had undertaken to serve. He was a certain Mr. Collis, a big fat man who welcomed me in his shirt sleeves, with a cigar in his mouth. He received me pleasantly and took me home to dinner with him. "Mr. Mackenzie has written about you," he said. "I'll be quite frank with you, Mr. Crawfurd. The firm is not exactly satisfied about the way business has been going lately at Blaauwildebeestefontein. There's a grand country up there, and a grand opportunity for the man who can take it. Japp, who is in charge, is an old man now and past his best, but he has been long with the firm, and we don't want to hurt his feelings. When he goes, which must be pretty soon, you'll have a good chance of the place, if you show yourself an active young fellow." He told me a good deal more about Blaauwildebeestefontein, principally trading details. Incidentally, he let drop that Mr. Japp had had several assistants in the last few years. I asked him why they had left, and he hesitated. "It's a lonely place, and they didn't like the life. You see, there are few white men near, and young fellows want society. They complained and were moved on, but the firm didn't think the more of them." I told him I had come out with the new schoolmaster. "Yes," he said reflectively, "the school. That's been vacant pretty often lately. What sort of fellow is this Wardlaw? Will he stay, I wonder?" "From all accounts," I said, "Blaauwildebeestefontein does not seem popular." "It isn't. That's why we've got you out from home. The colonial born doesn't find it fit in with his idea of comfort. He wants society, and he doesn't like too many natives. There's nothing up there but natives, and a few black veld Dutchmen with native blood in them. You fellows from home are less set on an easy life, or you wouldn't be here." There was something in Mr. Collis' tone which made me risk another question. "What's the matter with the place? There must be more wrong with it than loneliness to make everybody clear out. I have taken on this job and I mean to stick to it, so you needn't be afraid to tell me." The manager looked at me sharply. "That's the way to talk, my lad. You look as if you had a stiff back. So I'll be frank with you. There is something about the place. It gives the ordinary man the jumps. What it is I don't know, and the men who come back don't know themselves. I want you to find out for me. You'll be doing the firm an enormous service if you can get on the track of it. It may be the natives, or it may be the Takars, or it may be something else. Only old Japp can stick it out, and he's too old and doddering to care about moving. I want you to keep your eyes skinned, and write privately to me if you want any help. You're not out here for your health, I can see, and here's a chance for you to get your foot on the ladder. Remember, I'm your friend," he said to me again at the garden gate. "Take my advice and lie very low. Don't talk, don't meddle with drink. Learn all you can of the native jabber, and don't let on you understand a word. You're sure to get on the track of something. Goodbye, my boy," and he waved a fat hand to me. That night I embarked on a cargo boat which was going round the coast to Delagoa Bay. It is a small world, at least for us far wandering Scots, for who should I find when I got on board but my old friend Tam Dyke, who was second mate on the vessel. We wrung each other's hands, and I answered as best I could his questions about Kirkcaple. I had supper with him in the cabin, and went on deck to see the moorings cast. Suddenly there was a bustle on the quay, and a big man with a handbag forced his way up the gangway. The men who were getting ready to cast off tried to stop him, but he elbowed his way forward, declaring he must see the captain. Tam went up to him and asked civilly if he had a passage taken. He admitted he had not, but said he would make it right in 2 minutes with the captain himself. The Reverend John Laputa, for some reason of his own, was leaving Durban with more haste than he had entered it. I do not know what passed with the captain, but the minister got his passage right enough, and Tam was even turned out of his cabin to make room for him. This annoyed my friend intensely, That black brute must be made of money, for he paid through the nose for this, or I'm a Dutchman. My old man doesn't take to his black brethren any more than I do. Hang it all, what are we coming to when we're turning into a blooming cargo boat for niggers?" I had all too little of Tarn's good company, for on the afternoon of the second day we reached the little town of Lourenço Marques. This was my final landing in Africa, and I mind how eagerly I looked at the low, green shores and the bush-covered slopes of the mainland. We were landed from boats while the ship lay out in the bay, and Tam came ashore with me to spend the evening. By this time I had lost every remnant of homesickness. I had got a job before me which promised better things than colleging at Edinburgh, and I was as keen to get up country now as I had been loath to leave England. My mind being full of mysteries, I scanned every Portuguese loafer on the quay as if he had been a spy, and when Tam and I had had a bottle of Coularish in a café, I felt that at last I had got to foreign parts and a new world. Tam took me to supper with a friend of his, a Scot by the name of Aitken, who was landing agent for some big mining house on the Rand. He hailed from Fife and gave me a hearty welcome, for he had heard my father preach in his young days. Aitken was a strong, broad-shouldered fellow who had been a sergeant in the Gordons, and during the war he had done Secret Service work in Delagoa. He had hunted too, and traded up and down Mozambique, and knew every dialect of the Kaffirs. He asked me where I was bound for, and when I told him, there was the same look in his eyes as I had seen with the Durban manager. "You're going to a rum place, Mr. Crawfurd," he said. "So I'm told. Do you know anything about it? You're not the first who has looked queer when I've spoken the name." "I've never been there," he said, "though I've been pretty near it from the Portuguese side. That's the funny thing about Blaauwildebeestefontein. Everybody has heard of it, and nobody knows it. I wish you would tell me what you have heard." "Well, the natives are queer up there a ways. There's some kind of a holy place which every Kaffir from Algoa Bay to the Zambesi and away beyond knows about. When I've been hunting in the bushveld, I've often met strings of Kaffirs from hundreds of miles distant, and they've all been going or coming from Blaauwildebeestefontein. It's like Mecca to the Mohammedans, a place they go to on pilgrimage. I've heard of an old man up there who is believed to be 200 years old. Anyway, there's some sort of great witch or wizard living in the mountains." Aitken smoked in silence for a time. Then he said, "I'll tell you another thing. I believe there's a diamond mine. I've often meant to go up and look for it." Tam and I pressed him to explain, which he did slowly, after his fashion. "Did you ever hear of IDB, illicit diamond broking?" he asked me. "Well, it's notorious that the Kaffirs on the diamond fields get away with a fair number of stones, and they are bought by Jew and Portuguese traders. It's against the law to deal in them, and when I was in the intelligence here, we used to have a lot of trouble with the vermin. But I discovered that most of the stones came from natives in one part of the country, more or less round Blaauwildebeestefontein, and I see no reason to think that they had all been stolen from Kimberley or the Premier. Indeed, some of the stones I got hold of were quite different from any I had seen in South Africa before. I shouldn't wonder if the Kaffirs in the Zoutpansberg had struck some rich pipe and had the sense to keep quiet about it. Maybe some day I'll take a run up to see you and look into the matter." After this the talk turned on other topics till Tam, still nursing his grievance, asked a question on his own account. "Did you ever come across a great big native parson called Laputa? He came on board as we were leaving Durban, and I had to turn out of my cabin for him." Tam described him accurately, but vindictively, and added that he was sure he was up to no good. Aitken shook his head. "No, I don't know the man. You say he landed here? Well, I'll keep a lookout for him. Big native parsons are not so common." Then I asked about Henriques, of whom Tam knew nothing. I described his face, his clothes, and his habits. Aitken laughed uproariously. "Tut, my man, most of the subjects of his Majesty the King of Portugal would answer to that description. If he's a rascal as you think, you may be certain he's in the IDB business. And if I'm right about Blaauwildebeestefontein, you'll likely have news of him there some time or other. Drop me a line if he comes, and I'll get on to his record." I saw Tam off in the boat with a fairly satisfied mind. I was going to a place with a secret, and I meant to find it out. The natives round Blaauwildebeestefontein were queer, and diamonds were suspected somewhere in the neighbourhood. Henriques had something to do with the place, and so had the Reverend John Laputa, about whom I knew one strange thing. So did Tam, by the way, but he had not identified his former pursuer, and I had told him nothing. I was leaving two men behind me, Collis at Durban and Aitken at Lourenço Marques, who would help me if trouble came. Things were shaping well for some kind of adventure. The talk with Aitken had given Tam an inkling of my thoughts. His last words to me were an appeal to let him know if there were any fun going. "I can see you're in for a queer job. Promise to let me hear from you if there's going to be a row, and I'll come up country, though I should have to desert the service. Send us a letter to the agents at Durban, in case we should be in port. You haven't forgotten the Dive Burn, Davy." End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Prester John. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prester John by John Buchan. Chapter 3. Blaauwildebeestefontein. The Pilgrim's Progress had been the Sabbath reading of my boyhood, and as I came in sight of Blaauwildebeestefontein, a passage ran in my head. It was that which tells how Christian and Hopeful, after many perils of the way, came to the Delectable Mountains, from which they had a prospect of Canaan. After many dusty miles by rail, and a weariful journey in a Cape cart through arid plains and dry and stony gorges, I had come suddenly into a haven of green. The spring of the blue wildebeest was a clear rushing mountain torrent, which swirled over blue rocks into deep fern-fringed pools. All around was a tableland of lush grass with marigolds and arum lilies instead of daisies and buttercups. Thickets of tall trees dotted the hill slopes and patched the meadows as if some landscape gardener had been at work on them. Beyond, the glen fell steeply to the plains, which ran out in a faint haze to the horizon. To north and south I marked the sweep of the Berg, now rising high to a rocky peak, and now stretching in a level rampart of blue. On the very edge of the plateau, where the road dipped for the descent, stood the shanties of Blaauwildebeestefontein. The fresh hill air had exhilarated my mind, and the aromatic scent of the evening gave the last touch of intoxication. Whatever serpent might lurk in it, it was a veritable Eden I had come to. Blaauwildebeestefontein had no more than two buildings of civilized shape, the store, which stood on the left side of the river, and the schoolhouse opposite. For the rest, there were some 20 native huts, higher up the slope, of the type which the Dutch call rondavels. The schoolhouse had a pretty garden, but the store stood bare in a pitch of dust, with a few outhouses and sheds beside it. Round the door lay a few old ploughs and empty barrels, and beneath a solitary blue gum was a wooden bench with a rough table. Native children played in the dust, and an old Kaffir squatted by the wall. My few belongings were soon lifted from the Cape cart, and I entered the shop. It was the ordinary pattern of up-country store, a bar in one corner with an array of bottles, and all round the walls tins of canned food and the odds and ends of trade. The place was empty, and a cloud of flies buzzed over a sugar cask. Two doors opened at the back, and I chose the one to the right. I found myself in a kind of kitchen with a bed in one corner, and a litter of dirty plates on the table. On the bed lay a man, snoring heavily. I went close to him, and found an old fellow with a bald head, clothed only in a shirt and trousers. His face was red and swollen, and his breath came in heavy grunts. A smell of bad whisky hung over everything. I had no doubt that this was Mr. Peter Japp, my senior in the store. One reason for the indifferent trade at Blaauwildebeestefontein was very clear to me. The storekeeper was a sot. I went back to the shop and tried the other door. It was a bedroom too, but clean and pleasant. A little native girl, Zita I found they called her, was busy tidying it up, and when I entered she dropped me a curtsy. "This is your room, boss," she said in very good English in reply to my question. The child had been well trained somewhere, for there was a cracked dish full of oleander blossoms on the drawer's head, and the pillow slips on the bed were as clean as I could wish. She brought me water to wash and a cup of strong tea, while I carried my baggage indoors and paid the driver of the cart. Then, having cleaned myself and lit a pipe, I walked across the road to see Mr. Wardlaw. I found the schoolmaster sitting under his own fig tree, reading one of his Kaffir primers. Having come direct by rail from Cape Town, he had been a week in the place, and ranked as the second oldest white resident. "Yon's a bonny chief you've got, Davie," were his first words. "For 3 days he's been as fou as the Baltic." I cannot pretend that the misdeeds of Mr. Japp greatly annoyed me. I had the reversion of his job, and if he chose to play the fool, it was all in my interest. But the schoolmaster was depressed at the prospect of such company. "Besides you and me, he's the only white man in the place. It's a poor lookout on the social side." The school, it appeared, was the merest farce. There were only 5 white children, belonging to Dutch farmers in the mountains. The native side was more flourishing, but the mission schools in the locations got most of the native children in the neighbourhood. Mr. Wardlaw's educational zeal ran high. He talked of establishing a workshop and teaching carpentry and blacksmith's work, of which he knew nothing. He rhapsodized over the intelligence of his pupils, and bemoaned his inadequate gift of tongues. "You and I, Davie," he said, "must sit down and grind at the business. It is to the interest of both of us. The Dutch is easy enough. It's a sort of kitchen dialect you can learn in a fortnight. But these native languages are a stiff job. Sesotho is the chief hereabouts, and I'm told once you've got that it's easy to get Zulu. Then there's the thing the Shangans speak, Baronga, I think they call it. I've got a Christian Kaffir living up in one of the huts who comes every morning to talk to me for an hour. You'd better join me." I promised, and in the sweet-smelling dust crossed the road to the store. Japp was still sleeping, so I got a bowl of mealy porridge from Zita and went to bed. Japp was sober next morning and made me some kind of apology. He had chronic lumbago, he said, and to go on the bust now and then was the best cure for it. Then he proceeded to initiate me into my duties in a tone of exaggerated friendliness. "I took a fancy to you the first time I clapped eyes on you," he said. "You and me will be good friends, Crawfurd. I can see that. You're a spirited young fellow, and you'll stand no nonsense. The Dutch about here are a slim lot, and the Kaffirs are slimmer. Trust no man. That's my motto. The firm know that, and I've had their confidence for 40 years. The first day or two things went well enough. There was no doubt that, properly handled, a fine trade could be done in Blaauwildebeestefontein. The countryside was crawling with natives, and great strings used to come through from Shangaan territory on the way to the Rand mines. Besides, there was business to be done with the Dutch farmers, especially with the tobacco, which I foresaw could be worked up into a profitable export. There was no lack of money either, and we had to give very little credit, though it was often asked for. I flung myself into the work, and in a few weeks had been all round the farms and locations. At first Japp praised my energy, for it left him plenty of leisure to sit indoors and drink. But soon he grew suspicious, for he must have seen that I was in a fair way to oust him altogether. He was very anxious to know if I had seen Collis in Durban and what the manager had said. "I have letters," he told me 100 times, "from Mr. Mackenzie himself, praising me up to the skies. The firm couldn't get along without old Peter Japp, I can tell you." I had no wish to quarrel with the old man, so I listened politely to all he said. but this did not propitiate him, and I soon found him so jealous as to be a nuisance. He was colonial born, and was always airing the fact. He rejoiced in my rawness, and when I made a blunder would crow over it for hours. "It's no good, Mr. Crawford. You new chums from England may think yourselves mighty clever, but we men from the old colony can get ahead of you every time. In 50 years you'll maybe learn a little about the country, but we know all about it before we start." He roared with laughter at my way of tying a voorslag, and he made merry, no doubt with reason, on my management of a horse. I kept my temper pretty well, but I own there were moments when I came near to kicking Mr. Japp. The truth is, he was a disgusting old ruffian. His character was shown by his treatment of Zeeta. The poor child slaved all day, and did 2 men's work in keeping the household going. She was an orphan from a mission station, and in Japp's opinion a creature without rights. Hence he never spoke to her except with a curse, and used to cuff her thin shoulders till my blood boiled. One day things became too much for my temper. Zeeta had spilled half a glass of Japp's whisky while tidying up the room. He picked up a sjambok and proceeded to beat her unmercifully, till her cries brought me on the scene. I tore the whip from his hands, seized him by the scruff, and flung him on a heap of potato sacks, where he lay pouring out abuse and shaking with rage. Then I spoke my mind. I told him that if anything of the sort happened again, I would report it at once to Mr. Collis at Durban. I added that before making my report I would beat him within an inch of his degraded life. After a time he apologized, but I could see that henceforth he regarded me with deadly hatred. There was another thing I noticed about Mr. Japp. He might brag about his knowledge of how to deal with natives, but to my mind his methods were a disgrace to a white man. Zeeta came in for oaths and blows, but there were other Kaffirs whom he treated with a sort of cringing friendliness. A big black fellow would swagger into the shop and be received by Japp as if he were his long-lost brother. The two would collogue for hours, and though at first I did not understand the tongue, I could see that it was the white man who fawned and the black man who bullied. Once when Japp was away, one of these fellows came into the store as if it belonged to him, but he went out quicker than he entered. Japp complained afterwards of my behaviour. "Mwanga is a friend of mine," he said, "and brings us a lot of business. I'll thank you to be civil to him the next time." I replied very shortly that Mwanga, or anybody else who did not mend his manners, would feel the weight of my boot. The thing went on, and I am not sure that he did not give the Kaffirs drink on the sly. At any rate, I have seen some very drunk natives on the road between the locations and Blaauwildebeestefontein, and some of them I recognized as Japp's friends. I discussed the matter with Mr. Wardlaw, who said, "I believe the old villain has got some sort of black secret, and the natives know it, and have got a pull on him," and I was inclined to think he was right. By and by I began to feel the lack of company, for Wardlaw was so full of his books that he was of little use as a companion. So I resolved to acquire a dog, and bought one from a prospector who was stony broke and would have sold his soul for a drink. It was an enormous Boer hunting dog, a mongrel in whose blood ran mastiff and bulldog and foxhound, and heaven knows what besides. In colour it was a kind of brindled red, and the hair on its back grew against the lie of the rest of its coat. Someone had told me, or I may have read it, that a back like this meant that a dog would face anything mortal, even to a charging lion, and it was this feature which first caught my fancy. The price I paid was 10 shillings and a pair of boots, which I got at cost price from stock, and the owner departed with injunctions to me to beware of the brute's temper. Colin, for so I named him, began his career with me by taking the seat out of my breeches and frightening Mr. Wardlaw into a tree. It took me a stubborn battle of a fortnight to break his vice, and my left arm today bears witness to the struggle. After that he became a second shadow, and woe betide the man who had dared to raise his hand to Colin's master. Japp declared that the dog was a devil, and Colin repaid the compliment with a hearty dislike. With Colin I now took to spending some of my ample leisure in exploring the fastnesses of the Berg. I had brought out a shotgun of my own, and I borrowed a cheap Mauser sporting rifle from the store. I had been born with a good eye and a steady hand, and very soon I became a fair shot with a gun, and, I believe, a really fine shot with the rifle. The sides of the Berg were full of quail and partridge and bush pheasant, and on the grassy plateau there was abundance of a bird not unlike our own blackcock, which the Dutch called korhaan. But the great sport was to stalk bushbuck in the thickets, which is a game in which the hunter is at small advantage. I had been knocked down by a wounded bushbuck ram, and but for Colin might have been badly damaged. Once, in a kloof not far from the Letaba, I killed a fine leopard, bringing him down with a single shot from the rocky shelf almost on the top of Colin. His skin lies by my fireside as I write this tale. But it was during the days I could spare for an expedition into the plains that I proved the great qualities of my dog. There we had nobler game to follow, wildebeest and hartebeest, impala, and now and then a kudu. At first I was a complete duffer, and shamed myself in Colin's eyes. But by and by I learned something of veldcraft. I learned how to follow spoor, how to allow for the wind, and stalk under cover. Then when a shot had crippled the beast, Colin was on its track like a flash to pull it down. The dog had the nose of a retriever, the speed of a greyhound, and the strength of a bull terrier. I blessed the day when the wandering prospector had passed the store. Colin slept at night at the foot of my bed, and it was he who led me to make an important discovery, for I now became aware that I was being subjected to constant espionage. It may have been going on from the start, but it was not till my 3rd month at Blaauwildebeestefontein that I found it out. One night I was going to bed, when suddenly the bristles rose on the dog's back, and he barked uneasily at the window. I had been standing in the shadow, and as I stepped to the window to look out, I saw a black face disappear below the palisade of the backyard. The incident was trifling, but it put me on my guard. The next night I looked, but saw nothing. The 3rd night I looked, and caught a glimpse of a face almost pressed to the pane. Thereafter I put up the shutters after dark, and shifted my bed to a part of the room out of line with the window. It was the same out of doors. I would suddenly be conscious as I walked on the road that I was being watched. If I made as if to walk into the roadside bush, there would be a faint rustling, which told that the watcher had retired. The stalking was brilliantly done, for I never caught a glimpse of one of the stalkers. Wherever I went, on the road, on the meadows of the plateau, or on the rugged sides of the Berg, it was the same. I had silent followers who betrayed themselves now and then by the crackling of a branch, and eyes were always looking at me which I could not see. Only when I went down to the plains did the espionage cease. This thing annoyed Colin desperately, and his walks abroad were one continuous growl. Once, in spite of my efforts, he dashed into the thicket, and a squeal of pain followed. He had got somebody by the leg, and there was blood on the grass. Since I came to Blaauwildebeestefontein, I had forgotten the mystery I had set out to track in the excitement of a new life and my sordid contest with Japp. But now this espionage brought back my old preoccupation. I was being watched because some person or persons thought I was dangerous. My suspicions fastened on Japp, but I soon gave up that clue. It was my presence in the store that was a danger to him, not my wanderings about the countryside. It might be that he had engineered the espionage so as to drive me out of the place in sheer annoyance, but I flattered myself that Mr. Japp knew me too well to imagine that such a game was likely to succeed. The mischief was that I could not make out who the trackers were. I had visited all the surrounding locations, and was on good enough terms with all the chiefs. There was Mpefu, a dingy old fellow who had spent a good deal of his life in a Boer jail before the war. There was a mission station at his place, and his people seemed to me to be well behaved and prosperous. Majinje was a chieftainess, a little girl whom nobody was allowed to see. Her location was a miserable affair, and her tribe was yearly shrinking in numbers. Then there was Magata, further north among the mountains. He had no quarrel with me, for he used to give me a meal when I went out hunting in that direction, and once he turned out 100 of his young men, and I had a great battue of wild dogs. Sikitola, the biggest of all, lived some distance out in the flats. I knew less about him, but if his men were the trackers, they must have spent most of their days a weary way from their kraal. The Kaffirs in the huts at Blaauwildebeestefontein were mostly Christian, and quiet, decent fellows, who farmed their little gardens, and certainly preferred me to Japp. I thought at one time of riding into Pietersdorp to consult the native commissioner, but I discovered that the old man who knew the country was gone, and that his successor was a young fellow from Rhodesia, who knew nothing about anything. Besides, the natives round Blaauwildebeestefontein were well conducted, and received few official visitations. Now and then a couple of Zulu policemen passed in pursuit of some minor malefactor, and the collector came for the hut tax, but we gave the government little work, and they did not trouble their heads about us. As I have said, the clues I had brought out with me to Blaauwildebeestefontein began to occupy my mind again, and the more I thought of the business, the keener I grew. I used to amuse myself with setting out my various bits of knowledge. There was first of all the Reverend John Laputa, his doings on the Kirkcaple shore, his talk with Henriques about Blaauwildebeestefontein, and his strange behaviour at Durban. Then there was what Collis had told me about the place being queer, how nobody would stay long either in the store or the schoolhouse. Then there was my talk with Aitken at Lourenço Marques, and his story of a great wizard in the neighbourhood to whom all Kaffirs made pilgrimages, and the suspicion of a diamond pipe. Last and most important, there was this perpetual spying on myself. It was as clear as daylight that the place held some secret, and I wondered if old Japp knew. I was fool enough one day to ask him about diamonds. He met me with contemptuous laughter. "There's your ignorant Britisher," he cried. "If you had ever been to Kimberley, you would know the look of a diamond country. You're as likely to find diamonds here as ocean pearls. But go out and scrape in the spruit if you like. You'll maybe find some garnets." I made cautious inquiries too, chiefly through Mr. Wardlaw, who was becoming a great expert at Kaffir, about the existence of Aitken's wizard, but he could get no news. The most he found out was that there was a good cure for fever among Sikitola's men, and that Majinje, if she pleased, could bring rain. The upshot of it all was that, after much brooding, I wrote a letter to Mr. Collis, and to make sure of its going, gave it to a missionary to post in Pietersdorp. I told him frankly what Aitken had said, and I also told him about the espionage. I said nothing about old Japp, for beast as he was, I did not want him at his age to be without a livelihood. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Prester John. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prester John by John Buchan. Chapter 4. My Journey to the Winterveld. A reply came from Collis, addressed not to me but to Japp. It seemed that the old fellow had once suggested the establishment of a branch store at a place out in the plains called Umvelos', and the firm was now prepared to take up the scheme. Japp was in high good humour, and showed me the letter. Not a word was said of what I had written about, only the bare details about starting the branch. I was to get a couple of masons, load up 2 wagons with bricks and timber, and go down to Umvelos' to see the store built. The stocking of it and the appointment of a storekeeper would be matter for further correspondence. Japp was delighted, for besides getting rid of me for several weeks, it showed that his advice was respected by his superiors. He went about bragging that the firm could not get on without him, and was inclined to be more insolent to me than usual in his new self-esteem. He also got royally drunk over the head of it. I confess I was hurt by the manager's silence on what seemed to me more vital matters, but I soon reflected that if he wrote at all he would write direct to me. and I eagerly watched for the post runner. No letter came, however, and I was soon too busy with preparations to look for one. I got the bricks and timber from Pietersdorp, and hired 2 Dutch masons to run the job. The place was not very far from Sikitola's kraal, so there would be no difficulty about native helpers. Having my eyes open for trade, I resolved to kill 2 birds with one stone. It is the fashion among the old-fashioned farmers on the high veld to drive the cattle down into the bush veld, which they call the winter veld, for winter pasture. There is no fear of redwater about that season, and the grass of the plains is rich and thick compared with the uplands. I discovered that some big droves were passing on a certain day, and that the owners and their families were travelling with them in wagons. Accordingly, I had a light naachtmaal fitted up as a sort of travelling store, and with my 2 wagons full of building materials, joined the caravan. I hoped to do good trading in selling little luxuries to the farmers on the road and at Umvelos'. It was a clear, cold morning when we started down the Berg. At first my hands were full with the job of getting my heavy wagons down the awesome precipice which did duty as a highway. We locked the wheels with chains, and tied great logs of wood behind to act as brakes. Happily my drivers knew their business, but one of the Boer wagons got a wheel over the edge, and it was all that 10 men could do to get it back again. After that the road was easier, winding down the side of a slowly opening glen. I rode beside the wagons, and so heavenly was the weather that I was content with my own thoughts. The sky was clear blue, the air warm, yet with a wintry tonic in it, and 1,000 aromatic scents came out of the thickets. The pied birds called Kaffir queens fluttered across the path. Below, the Klein Labongo churned and foamed in 100 cascades. Its waters were no more the clear grey of the blue wildebeest spring, but were growing muddy with its approach to the richer soil of the plains. Oxen travel slow, and we outspanned that night half a day's march short of Umvelos'. I spent the hour before sunset lounging and smoking with the Dutch farmers. At first they had been silent and suspicious of a newcomer, but by this time I talked their taal fluently, and we were soon on good terms. I recall a discussion arising about a black thing in a tree about 500 yards away. I thought it was an aasvogel, but another thought it was a baboon, whereupon the oldest of the party, a farmer called Coetzee, whipped up his rifle, and apparently without sighting, fired. A dark object fell out of a branch, and when we reached it we found it a baviaan, sure enough, shot through the head. "Which side are you on in the next war?" the old man asked me, and laughing, I told him, "Yours." After supper, the ingredients of which came largely from my naachtmaal, we sat smoking and talking round the fire, the women and children being snug in the covered wagons. The Boers were honest, companionable fellows, and when I had made a bowl of toddy in the Scotch fashion to keep out the evening chill, we all became excellent friends. They asked me how I got on with Jap. Old Coetzee saved me the trouble of answering, for he broke in with "Skellum, skellum." I asked him his objection to the storekeeper, but he would say nothing beyond that he was too thick with the natives. I fancy at some time Mr. Japp had sold him a bad plough. We spoke of hunting, and I heard long tales of exploits away on the Limpopo, in Mashonaland, on the Sabi, and in the Lebombo. Then we verged on politics, and I listened to violent denunciations of the new land tax. These were old residenters, I reflected, and I might learn perhaps something of value. So very carefully I repeated a tale I said I had heard at Durban of a great wizard somewhere in the Berg, and asked if anyone knew of it. They shook their heads. The natives had given up witchcraft and big medicine, they said, and were more afraid of a parson or a policeman than any witch doctor. Then they were starting on reminiscences when old Coetzee, who was deaf, broke in and asked to have my question repeated. "Yes," he said, "I know. It is in the Rooirand. There is a devil dwells there." I could get no more out of him beyond the fact that there was certainly a great devil there. His grandfather and father had seen it, and he himself had heard it roaring when he had gone there as a boy to hunt. He would explain no further, and went to bed. Next morning, close to Sikitola's kraal, I bade the farmers good bye, after telling them that there would be a store in my wagon for 3 weeks at Umvelos' if they wanted supplies. We then struck more to the north towards our destination. As soon as they had gone, I had out my map and searched it for the name old Coetzee had mentioned. It was a very bad map, for there had been no surveying east of the Berg, and most of the names were mere guesses. But I found the word Rooirand, marking an eastern continuation of the northern wall, and probably set down from some hunter's report. I had better explain here the chief features of the country, for they bulk largely in my story. The Berg runs north and south, and from it run the chief streams which water the plain. They are, beginning from the south, the Olifants, the Groot Letaba, the Letsitela, the Klein Letaba, and the Klein Labongo, on which stands Blaauwildebeestefontein. But the greatest river of the plain, into which the others ultimately flow, is the Groot Labongo, which appears full born from some subterranean source close to the place called Umvelos'. North from Blaauwildebeestefontein the Berg runs for some 20 miles, and then makes a sharp turn eastward, becoming, according to my map, the Rooirand. I pored over these details, and was particularly curious about the Great Labongo. It seemed to me unlikely that a spring in the bush could produce so great a river, and I decided that its source must lie in the mountains to the north. As well as I could guess, the Rooirand, the nearest part of the Berg, was about 50 miles distant. Old Coetzee had said that there was a devil in the place, but I thought that if it were explored, the first thing found would be a fine stream of water. We got to Umvelos' after midday, and outspanned for our 3 weeks' work. I set the Dutchman to unload and clear the ground for foundations, while I went off to Sikitola to ask for labourers. I got a dozen lusty blacks, and soon we had a business-like encampment, and the work went on merrily. It was rough architecture and rougher masonry. All we aimed at was a 2-roomed shop, with a kind of outhouse for stores. I was architect, and watched the marking out of the foundations and the first few feet of the walls. Sikitola's people proved themselves good helpers, and most of the building was left to them, while the Dutchman worked at the carpentry. Bricks ran short before we got very far, and we had to set to brickmaking on the bank of the Labongo, and finish off the walls with green bricks, which gave the place a queer piebald look. I was not much of a carpenter, and there were plenty of builders without me, so I found a considerable amount of time on my hands. At first I acted as a shopkeeper in the Nachtmaal, but I soon cleared out my stores to the Dutch farmers and the natives. I had thought of going back for more, and then it occurred to me that I might profitably give some of my leisure to the Rooirand. I could see the wall of the mountains quite clear to the north, within an easy day's ride. So one morning I packed enough food for a day or two, tied my sleeping bag on my saddle, and set off to explore, after appointing the elder of the Dutchmen foreman of the job in my absence. It was very hot jogging along the native path with the eternal olive-green bush around me. Happily there was no fear of my losing the way, for the Rooirand stood very clear in front, and slowly as I advanced I began to make out the details of the cliffs. At luncheon time, when I was about halfway, I sat down with my Zeiss glass, my mother's farewell gift, to look for the valley. But valley I saw none. The wall, reddish purple it looked, and I thought of porphyry, was continuous and unbroken. There were chimneys and fissures, but none great enough to hold a river. The top was sheer cliff. Then came loose kranzes in tiers like the seats in a gallery, and below, a dense thicket of trees. I raked the whole line for a break, but there seemed none. "It's a bad job for me," I thought. if there is no water, for I must pass the night there. The night was spent in a sheltered nook at the foot of the rocks, but my horse and I went to bed without a drink. My supper was some raisins and biscuits, for I did not dare to run the risk of increasing my thirst. I had found a great bank of debris sloping up to the kranzes, and thick wood clothing all the slope. The grass seemed wonderfully fresh, but of water there was no sign. There was not even the sandy channel of a stream to dig in. In the morning I had a difficult problem to face. Water I must find at all costs, or I must go home. There was time enough for me to get back without suffering much, but if so I must give up my explorations. This I was determined not to do. The more I looked at these red cliffs, the more eager I was to find out their secret. There must be water somewhere, otherwise how account for the lushness of the vegetation? My horse was a veld pony, so I set him loose to see what he would do. He strayed back on the path to Umvelos'. This looked bad, for it meant that he did not smell water along the cliff front. If I was to find a stream, it must be on the top, and I must try a little mountaineering. Then, taking my courage in both my hands, I decided. I gave my pony a cut and set him off on the homeward road. I knew he was safe to get back in 4 or 5 hours, and in broad day there was little fear of wild beasts attacking him. I had tied my sleeping bag onto the saddle, and had with me but 2 pocketfuls of food. I had also fastened on the saddle a letter to my Dutch foreman, bidding him send a native with a spare horse to fetch me by the evening. Then I started off to look for a chimney. A boyhood spent on the cliffs at Kirkcaple had made me a bold cragsman, and the porphyry of the Rooirand clearly gave excellent holds. But I walked many weary miles along the cliff foot before I found a feasible road. To begin with, it was no light task to fight one's way through the dense undergrowth to the lower slopes. Every kind of thorn bush lay in wait for my skin. Creepers tripped me up. High trees shut out the light, and I was in mortal fear lest a black mamba might appear out of the tangle. It grew very hot, and the screes above the thicket were blistering to the touch. My tongue, too, stuck to the roof of my mouth with thirst. The first chimney I tried ran out on the face into nothingness, and I had to make a dangerous descent. The second was a deep gully, but so choked with rubble that after nearly braining myself I desisted. Still going eastwards, I found a sloping ledge which took me to a platform, from which ran a crack with a little tree growing in it. My glass showed me that beyond this tree the crack broadened into a clearly defined chimney, which led to the top. If I can once reach that tree, I thought, the battle is won. The crack was only a few inches wide, large enough to let in an arm and a foot, and it ran slantwise up a perpendicular rock. I do not think I realized how bad it was till I had gone too far to return. Then my foot jammed, and I paused for breath with my legs and arms cramping rapidly. I remember that I looked to the west and saw through the sweat which kept dropping into my eyes that about half a mile off a piece of cliff which looked unbroken from the foot had a fold in it to the right. The darkness of the fold showed me that it was a deep, narrow gully. However, I had no time to think of this, for I was fast in the middle of my confounded crack. With immense labour I found a chockstone above my head, and managed to force my foot free. The next few yards were not so difficult, and then I stuck once more. For the crack suddenly grew shallow as the cliff bulged out above me. I had almost given up hope when I saw that about 3 feet above my head grew the tree. If I could reach it and swing out, I might hope to pull myself up to the ledge on which it grew. I confess it needed all my courage, for I did not know but that the tree might be loose, and that it and I might go rattling down 400 feet. It was my only hope, however, so I set my teeth, and wriggling up a few inches, made a grab at it. Thank God it held, and with a great effort I pulled my shoulder over the ledge and breathed freely. My difficulties were not ended, but the worst was past. The rest of the gully gave me good and safe climbing, and presently a very limp and weary figure lay on the cliff top. It took me many minutes to get back my breath and to conquer the faintness which seized me as soon as the need for exertion was over. When I scrambled to my feet and looked round, I saw a wonderful prospect. It was a plateau like the High Veld, only covered with bracken and little bushes like hazels. 3 or 4 miles off the ground rose and a shallow vale opened, but in the foreground, half a mile or so distant, a lake lay gleaming in the sun. I could scarcely believe my eyes as I ran towards it, and doubts of a mirage haunted me. But it was no mirage, but a real lake, perhaps 3 miles in circumference, with bracken fringed banks, a shore of white pebbles, and clear deep blue water. I drank my fill and then stripped and swam in the blessed coolness. After that I ate some luncheon and sunned myself on a flat rock. I have discovered the source of the Labongo, I said to myself. I will write to the Royal Geographical Society and they will give me a medal. I walked round the lake to look for an outlet. A fine mountain stream came in at the north end, and at the south end, sure enough, a considerable river debouched. My exploring zeal redoubled, and I followed its course in a delirium of expectation. It was a noble stream, clear as crystal, and very unlike the muddy tropical Labongo at Umvelos'. Suddenly, about a quarter of a mile from the lake, the land seemed to grow over it, and with a swirl and a hollow roar it disappeared into a pothole. I walked a few steps on, and from below my feet came the most uncanny rumbling and groaning. Then I knew what old Coetzee's devil was that howled in the Rooirand. Had I continued my walk to the edge of the cliff, I might have learned a secret which would have stood me in good stead later. But the descent began to make me anxious, and I retraced my steps to the top of the chimney whence I had come. I was resolved that nothing would make me descend by that awesome crack, so I kept on eastward along the top to look for a better way. I found one about a mile farther on, which, though far from easy, had no special risks save from the appalling looseness of the debris. When I got down at length, I found that it was near sunset. I went to the place where I had bidden my native look for me, but as I had feared, there was no sign of him. So, making the best of a bad job, I had supper and a pipe, and spent a very chilly night in a hole among the boulders. I got up at dawn, stiff and cold, and ate a few raisins for breakfast. There was no sign of horses, so I resolved to fill up the time in looking for the fold of the cliff, which, as I had seen from the horrible crack of yesterday, contained a gully. It was a difficult job, for to get the sidelong view of the cliff I had to scramble through the undergrowth of the slopes again, and even a certain way up the kranzes. At length I got my bearings, and fixed the place by some tall trees in the bush. Then I descended and walked westwards. Suddenly, as I neared the place, I heard the strangest sound coming from the rocks. It was a deep muffled groaning, so eerie and unearthly that for a moment I stood and shivered. Then I remembered my river of yesterday. It must be above this place that it descended into the earth, and in the hush of dawn the sound was naturally louder. No wonder old Coetzee had been afraid of devils. It reminded me of the lines in Marmion: diving as if condemned to lave some demon's subterranean cave, who, prisoned by enchanter's spell, shakes the dark rock with groan and yell. While I was standing awestruck by the sound, I observed a figure moving towards the cliffs. I was well in cover, so I could not have been noticed. It was a very old man, very tall, but bowed in the shoulders, who was walking slowly with bent head. He could not have been 30 yards from me, so I had a clear view of his face. He was a native, but of a type I had never seen before. A long white beard fell on his breast, and a magnificent kaross of leopard skin covered his shoulders. His face was seamed and lined and shrunken, so that he seemed as old as time itself. Very carefully I crept after him, and found myself opposite the fold where the gully was. There was a clear path through the jungle, a path worn smooth by many feet. I followed it through the undergrowth, and over the screes till it turned inside the fold of the gully, and then it stopped short. I was in a deep cleft, but in front was a slab of sheer rock. Above, the gully looked darker and deeper, but there was this great slab to pass. I examined the sides, but they were sheer rock with no openings. Had I had my wits about me, I would have gone back and followed the spoor, noting where it stopped. But the whole thing looked black magic to me. My stomach was empty, and my enterprise small. Besides, there was the terrible moaning of the imprisoned river in my ears. I am ashamed to confess it, but I ran from that gully as if the devil and all his angels had been following me. Indeed, I did not slacken till I had put a good mile between me and those uncanny cliffs. After that I set out to foot it back. If the horses would not come to me, I must go to them. I walked 25 miles in a vile temper, enraged at my Dutchmen, my natives, and everybody. The truth is, I had been frightened, and my pride was sore about it. It grew very hot, the sand rose and choked me. The mopani trees with their dull green wearied me. The Kaffir queens and jays and rollers which flew about the path seemed to be there to mock me. About halfway home I found a boy and 2 horses, and roundly I cursed him. It seemed that my pony had returned right enough, and the boy had been sent to fetch me. He had got halfway before sunset the night before, and there he had stayed. I discovered from him that he was scared to death, and did not dare to go any nearer the Rooirand. It was accursed, he said, for it was an abode of devils, and only wizards went near it. I was bound to admit to myself that I could not blame him. At last I had got on the track of something certain about this mysterious country, and all the way back I wondered if I should have the courage to follow it up. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Prester John. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prester John by John Buchan. Chapter 5. Mr. Wardlaw has a premonition. A week later the building job was finished. I locked the door of the new store, pocketed the key, and we set out for home. Sikitola was entrusted with the general care of it, and I knew him well enough to be sure that he would keep his people from doing mischief. I left my empty wagons to follow at their leisure, and rode on, with the result that I arrived at Blaauwildebeestefontein 2 days before I was looked for. I stabled my horse and went round to the back to see Colin. I had left him at home in case of fights with native dogs, for he was an ill beast in a crowd. I found him well and hearty, for Zeeta had been looking after him. Then some whim seized me to enter the store through my bedroom window. It was open, and I crawled softly in to find the room fresh and clean from Zeeta's care. The door was ajar, and hearing voices, I peeped into the shop. Japp was sitting on the counter talking in a low voice to a big native, the same Mwanga whom I had bundled out unceremoniously. I noticed that the outer door giving on the road was shut, a most unusual thing in the afternoon. Japp had some small objects in his hand, and the two were evidently arguing about a price. I had no intention at first of eavesdropping, and was just about to push the door open, when something in Japp's face arrested me. He was up to no good, and I thought it my business to wait. The low tones went on for a little, both men talking in Kaffir, and then Japp lifted up one of the little objects between finger and thumb. It was a small roundish stone about the size of a bean, but even in that half light there was a dull lustre in it. At that I shoved the door open and went in. Both men started as if they had been shot. Japp went as white as his mottled face permitted. "What the—" he gasped, and he dropped the thing he was holding. I picked it up and laid it on the counter. "So," I said, "diamonds, Mr. Japp. You have found the pipe I was looking for. I congratulate you." My words gave the old ruffian his cue. "Yes, yes," he said, "I have, or rather my friend Mwanga has. He has just been telling me about it." The Kaffir looked miserably uncomfortable. He shifted from one leg to the other, casting longing glances at the closed door. "I tink I go," he said. "Afterwards we will speak more." I told him I thought he had better go, and opened the door for him. Then I bolted it again and turned to Mr. Japp. "So that's your game," I said. "I thought there was something funny about you, but I didn't know it was IDB you were up to." He looked as if he could kill me. For 5 minutes he cursed me with a perfection of phrase which I had thought was beyond him. It was no IDB, he declared, but a pipe which 'Mwanga had discovered. "In this kind of country?" I said, quoting his own words. "Why, you might as well expect to find ocean pearls as diamonds. But scrape in the spruit if you like, you'll maybe find some garnets." He choked down his wrath and tried a new tack. "What will you take to hold your tongue? I'll make you a rich man if you'll come in with me." And then he started with offers which showed that he had been making a good thing out of the traffic. I stalked over to him and took him by the shoulder. "You old reprobate," I roared, "if you breathe such a proposal to me again, I'll tie you up like a sack and carry you to Pietersdorp." At this he broke down and wept maudlin tears, disgusting to witness. He said he was an old man who had always lived honestly, and it would break his heart if his grey hairs were to be disgraced. As he sat rocking himself with his hands over his face, I saw his wicked little eyes peering through the slits of his fingers to see what my next move would be. "See here, Mr. Japp," I said, "I'm not a police spy, and it's no business of mine to inform against you. I'm willing to keep you out of jail, but it must be on my own conditions. The first is that you resign this job and clear out. You will write to Mr. Colles a letter at my dictation, saying that you find the work too much for you. The second is that for the time you remain here, the diamond business must utterly cease. If 'Mwanga or anybody like him comes inside the store, and if I get the slightest hint that you're back at the trade, in you go to Pietersdorp. I'm not going to have my name disgraced by being associated with you. The third condition is that when you leave this place you go clear away. If you come within 20 miles of Blaauwildebeestefontein and I find you, I will give you up." He groaned and writhed at my terms, but in the end accepted them. He wrote the letter, and I posted it. I had no pity for the old scamp, who had feathered his nest well. Small wonder that the firm's business was not as good as it might be, when Japp was giving most of his time to buying diamonds from native thieves. The secret put him in the power of any Kaffir who traded him a stone. No wonder he cringed to ruffians like 'Mwanga. The second thing I did was to shift my quarters. Mr. Wardlaw had a spare room which he had offered me before, and now I accepted it. I wanted to be no more mixed up with Japp than I could help, for I did not know what villainy he might let me in for. Moreover, I carried Zeeta with me, being ashamed to leave her at the mercy of the old bully. Japp went up to the huts and hired a slattern to mind his house, and then drank heavily for 3 days to console himself. That night I sat smoking with Mr. Wardlaw in his sitting room, where a welcome fire burned, for the nights on the Berg were chilly. I remember the occasion well for the queer turn the conversation took. Mr. Wardlaw, as I have said, had been working like a slave at the Kaffir tongues. I talked a kind of Zulu well enough to make myself understood, and I could follow it when spoken, but he had real scholarship in the thing, and knew all about the grammar and the different dialects. Further, he had read a lot about native history, and was full of the doings of Shaka and Muzilakatsa and Moshesh and the kings of old. Having little to do in the way of teaching, he had made up for it by reading omnivorously. He used to borrow books from the missionaries, and he must have spent half his salary in buying new ones. Tonight, as he sat and puffed in his armchair, he was full of stories about a fellow called Monomotapa. It seems he was a great black emperor whom the Portuguese discovered about the 16th century. He lived to the north in Mashonaland, and had a mountain full of gold. The Portuguese did not make much of him, but they got his son and turned him into a priest. I told Wardlaw that he was most likely only a petty chief, whose exploits were magnified by distance, the same as the caciques in Mexico. But the schoolmaster would not accept this. "He must have been a big man, Davy. You know that the old ruins in Rhodesia, called Zimbabwe, were long believed to be Phoenician in origin. I have a book here which tells all about them, but now it is believed that they were built by natives. I maintain that the men who could erect piles like that," and he showed me a picture, "were something more than petty chiefs." Presently the object of this conversation appeared. Mr. Wardlaw thought that we were underrating the capacity of the native. This opinion was natural enough in a schoolmaster, but not in the precise form Wardlaw put it. It was not his intelligence which he thought we underrated, but his dangerousness. His reasons shortly were these. There were 5 or 6 of them to every white man. They were all, roughly speaking, of the same stock, with the same tribal beliefs. They had only just ceased being a warrior race, with a powerful military discipline, and most important, they lived round the rim of the high veld plateau, and if they combined, could cut off the white man from the sea. I pointed out to him that it would only be a matter of time before we opened the road again. "Ay," he said, "but think of what would happen before then. Think of the lonely farms and the little dorps wiped out of the map. It would be a second and bloodier Indian mutiny. I'm not saying it's likely," he went on, "but I maintain it's possible. Supposing a second Chaka turned up, who could get the different tribes to work together, it wouldn't be so very hard to smuggle in arms. Think of the long unwatched coast in Gazaland and Tongaland. If they got a leader with prestige enough to organise a crusade against the white man, I don't see what could prevent a rising." "We should get wind of it in time to crush it at the start," I said. "I'm not so sure. They are cunning fellows, and have arts that we know nothing about. You have heard of native telepathy? They can send news over 1,000 miles as quick as the telegraph, and we have no means of tapping the wires. If they ever combined, they could keep it as secret as the grave. My houseboy might be in the rising, and I would never suspect it till one fine morning he cut my throat. But they would never find a leader. If there was some exiled prince of Chaka's blood, who came back like Prince Charlie to free his people, there might be danger. But their royalties are fat men with top hats and old frock coats, who live in dirty locations." Wardlaw admitted this, but said that there might be other kinds of leaders. He had been reading a lot about Ethiopianism, which educated American Negroes had been trying to preach in South Africa. He did not see why a kind of bastard Christianity should not be the motive of a rising. The Kaffirs find it an easy job to mix up Christian emotion and pagan practice. Look at Haiti and some of the performances in the southern states. Then he shook the ashes out of his pipe and leaned forward with a solemn face. "I'll admit the truth to you, Davy. I'm black afraid." He looked so earnest and serious, sitting there with his short-sighted eyes peering at me, that I could not help being impressed. "Whatever is the matter?" I asked. "Has anything happened?" He shook his head. "Nothing I can put a name to, but I have a presentiment that some mischief is afoot in these hills. I feel it in my bones." I confess I was startled by these words. You must remember that I had never given a hint of my suspicions to Mr. Wardlaw, beyond asking him if a wizard lived in the neighbourhood, a question anybody might have put. But here was the schoolmaster discovering for himself some mystery in Blaauwildebeestefontein. I tried to get at his evidence, but it was very little. He thought there were an awful lot of blacks about. "The woods are full of them," he said. I gathered he did not imagine he was being spied on, but merely felt that there were more natives about than could be explained. "There's another thing," he said. "The native bairns have all left the school. I've only 3 scholars left, and they are from Dutch farms. I went to Majinje to find out what was up, and an old crone told me the place was full of bad men. I tell you, Davy, there's something brewing, and that something is not good for us." There was nothing new to me in what Wardlaw had to tell, and yet that talk late at night by a dying fire made me feel afraid for the second time since I had come to Blaauwildebeestefontein. I had a clue, and had been on the lookout for mysteries, but that another should feel the strangeness for himself made it seem desperately real to me. Of course I scoffed at Mr. Wardlaw's fears. I could not have him spoiling all my plans by crying up a native rising for which he had not a scrap of evidence. "Have you been writing to anybody?" I asked him. He said that he had told no one, but he meant to, unless things got better. "I haven't the nerve for this job, Davy," he said. "I'll have to resign, and it's a pity, for the place suits my health fine. You see I know too much, and I haven't your Winston nerve and total lack of imagination." I told him that it was simply fancy, and came from reading too many books and taking too little exercise. But I made him promise to say nothing to anybody, either by word of mouth or letter, without telling me first. Then I made a rummer of toddy and sent him to bed a trifle comforted. The first thing I did in my new room was to shift the bed into the corner out of line with the window. There were no shutters, so I put up an old tabletop and jammed it between the window frames. Also I loaded my shotgun and kept it by my bedside. Had Wardlaw seen these preparations, he might have thought more of my imagination and less of my nerve. It was a real comfort to me to put out a hand in the darkness and feel Colin's shaggy coat. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Prester John. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prester John by John Buchan. Chapter 6. The drums beat at sunset. Jap was drunk for the next day or two, and I had the business of the store to myself. I was glad of this, for it gave me leisure to reflect upon the various perplexities of my situation. As I have said, I was really scared, more out of a sense of impotence than from dread of actual danger. I was in a fog of uncertainty. Things were happening around me which I could only dimly guess at, and I had no power to take one step in defence. That Wardlaw should have felt the same without any hint from me was the final proof that the mystery was no figment of my nerves. I had written to Collis and got no answer. Now the letter with Jap's resignation in it had gone to Durban. Surely some notice would be taken of that. If I was given the post, Collis was bound to consider what I had said in my earlier letter and give me some directions. Meanwhile it was my business to stick to my job till I was relieved. A change had come over the place during my absence. The natives had almost disappeared from sight. Except the few families living round Blaauwildebeestefontein, one never saw a native on the roads, and none came into the store. They were sticking close to their locations, or else they had gone after some distant business. Except a batch of 3 Shangans returning from the Rand, I had nobody in the store for the whole of one day. So about 4 o'clock I shut it up, whistled to Colin, and went for a walk along the Berg. If there were no natives on the road, there were plenty in the bush. I had the impression, of which Wardlaw has spoken, that the native population of the countryside had suddenly been hugely increased. The woods were simply hatching with them. I was being spied on as before, but now there were so many at the business that they could not all conceal their tracks. Every now and then I had a glimpse of a black shoulder or leg, and Colin, whom I kept on the leash, was half mad with excitement. I had seen all I wanted, and went home with a preoccupied mind. I sat long on Wardlaw's garden seat, trying to puzzle out the truth of this spying. What perplexed me was that I had been left unmolested when I had gone to Umvelos'. Now, as I conjectured, the secret of the neighbourhood, whatever it was probably connected with the Rooirand. But when I had ridden in that direction, and had spent 2 days in exploring, no one had troubled to watch me. I was quite certain about this, for my eye had grown quick to note espionage, and it is harder for a spy to hide in the spare bush of the flats than in the dense thickets of these uplands. The watchers then did not mind my fossicking round their sacred place. Why then was I so closely watched in the harmless neighbourhood of the store? I thought for a long time before an answer occurred to me. The reason must be that going to the plains I was going into native country and away from civilization. But Blaauwildebeestefontein was near the frontier. There must be some dark business brewing of which they may have feared that I had an inkling. They wanted to see if I proposed to go to Pietersdorp or Wesselsburg and tell what I knew, and they clearly were resolved that I should not. I laughed, I remember, thinking that they had forgotten the post bag, but then I reflected that I knew nothing of what might be happening daily to the post bag. When I had reached this conclusion, my first impulse was to test it by riding straight west on the main road. If I was right, I should certainly be stopped. On second thoughts, however, this seemed to me to be flinging up the game prematurely, and I resolved to wait a day or two before acting. Next day nothing happened save that my sense of loneliness increased. I felt that I was being hemmed in by barbarism and cut off in a ghoulish land from the succour of my own kind. I only kept my courage up by the necessity of presenting a brave face to Mr. Wardlaw, who was by this time in a very broken condition of nerves. I had often thought that it was my duty to advise him to leave, and to see him safely off, but I shrank from severing myself from my only friend. I thought too of the few Dutch farmers within riding distance, and had half a mind to visit them, but they were far over the plateau, and could know little of my anxieties. The third day events moved faster. Japp was sober and wonderfully quiet. He gave me good morning quite in a friendly tone, and set to posting up the books as if he had never misbehaved in his days. I was so busy with my thoughts that I, too, must have been gentler than usual, and the morning passed like a honeymoon till I went across to dinner. I was just sitting down when I remembered that I had left my watch in my waistcoat behind the counter, and started to go back for it, but at the door I stopped short, for two horsemen had drawn up before the store. One was a native with what I took to be saddlebags. The other was a small, slim man with a sun helmet, who was slowly dismounting. Something in the cut of his jib struck me as familiar. I slipped into the empty schoolroom and stared hard. Then, as he half turned in handing his bridle to the Kaffir, I got a sight of his face. It was my former shipmate, Henriques. He said something to his companion and entered the store. You may imagine that my curiosity ran to fever heat. My first impulse was to march over for my waistcoat and make a third with Japp at the interview. Happily I reflected in time that Henriques knew my face, for I had grown no beard, having a great dislike to needless hair. If he was one of the villains in the drama, he would mark me down for his vengeance once he knew I was here, whereas at present he had probably forgotten all about me. Besides, if I walked in boldly I would get no news. If Japp and he had a secret, they would not blab it in my presence. My next idea was to slip in by the back to the room I had once lived in. But how was I to cross the road? It ran white and dry some distance each way, in full view of the Kaffir with the horses. Further, the store stood on a bare patch, and it would be a hard job to get in by the back, assuming, as I believed, that the neighbourhood was thick with spies. The upshot was that I got my glasses and turned them on the store. The door was open, and so was the window. In the gloom of the interior I made out Henriques' legs. He was standing by the counter and apparently talking to Japp. He moved to shut the door, and came back inside my focus opposite the window. There he stayed for maybe 10 minutes, while I hugged my impatience. I would have given £100 to be snug in my old room, with Japp thinking me out of the store. Suddenly the legs twitched up, and his boots appeared above the counter. Japp had invited him to his bedroom, and the game was now to be played beyond my ken. This was more than I could stand, so I stole out at the back door, and took to the thickest bush on the hillside. My notion was to cross the road half a mile down, where it had dropped into the defile of the stream, and then to come swiftly up the edge of the water, so as to effect a back entrance into the store. As fast as I dared, I tore through the bush, and in about a quarter of an hour had reached the point I was making for. Then I bore down to the road, and was in the scrub about 10 yards off it, when the clatter of horses pulled me up again. Peeping out, I saw that it was my friend and his Kaffir follower. who were riding at a very good pace for the plains. Toilfully and crossly I returned on my tracks to my long delayed dinner. Whatever the purport of their talk, Japp and the Portuguese had not taken long over it. In the store that afternoon I said casually to Japp that I had noticed visitors at the door during my dinner hour. The old man looked me frankly enough in the face. Yes, it was Mr. Hendricks, he said, and explained that the man was a Portuguese trader from Delagoa way, who had a lot of Kaffir stores east of the Lebombo Hills. I asked his business and was told that he always gave Japp a call in when he was passing. "Do you take every man that calls into your bedroom and shut the door?" I asked. Japp lost colour and his lip trembled. "I swear to God, Mr. Crawfurd, I've been doing nothing wrong. I've kept the promise I gave you like an oath to my mother. I see you suspect me, and maybe you've cause, but I'll be quite honest with you. I have dealt in diamonds before this with Hendricks, but today when he asked me, I told him that that business was off. I only took him to my room to give him a drink. He likes brandy and there's no supply in the shop." I distrusted Japp wholeheartedly enough, but I was convinced that in this case he spoke the truth. "Had the man any news?" I asked. "He had and he hadn't," said Japp. "He was always a sullen beggar and never spoke much, but he said one queer thing. He asked me if I was going to retire, and when I told him yes, he said I had put it off rather long. I told him I was as healthy as I ever was, and he laughed in his dirty Portugoose way. 'Yes, Mr. Japp,' he says, 'but the country is not so healthy.' I wonder what the chap meant. He'll be dead of Blackwater before many months, to judge by his eyes." This talk satisfied me about Japp, who was clearly in desperate fear of offending me, and disinclined to return for the present to his old ways. But I think the rest of the afternoon was the most wretched time in my existence. It was as plain as daylight that we were in for some grave trouble to which I believed that I alone held any kind of clue. I had a pile of evidence. The visit of Henriques was the last bit, which pointed to some great secret approaching its disclosure. I thought that that disclosure meant blood and ruin, but I knew nothing definite. If the commander of a British army had come to me then and there and offered help, I could have done nothing, only asked him to wait, like me. The peril, whatever it was, did not threaten me only, though I and Wardlaw and Japp might be the first to suffer. But I had a terrible feeling that I alone could do something to ward it off, and just what that something was, I could not tell. I was horribly afraid, not only of unknown death, but of my impotence to play any manly part. I was alone, knowing too much and yet too little, and there was no chance of help under the broad sky. I cursed myself for not writing to Aitken at Lourenço Marques weeks before. He had promised to come up, and he was the kind of man who kept his word. In the late afternoon I dragged Wardlaw out for a walk. In his presence I had to keep up a forced cheerfulness, and I believe the pretence did me good. We took a path up the Berg among groves of stinkwood and essenwood, where a falling stream made an easy route. It may have been fancy, but it seemed to me that the wood was emptier and that we were followed less closely. I remember it was a lovely evening, and in the clear, fragrant gloaming, every foreland of the Berg stood out like a great ship above the dark green sea of the bush. When we reached the edge of the plateau, we saw the sun sinking between two far blue peaks in Makapan's country, and away to the south the great roll of the high veld. I longed miserably for that country where white men were thronged together in dorps and cities. As we gazed, a curious sound struck our ears. It seemed to begin far up in the north, a low roll like the combing of breakers on the sand. Then it grew louder and travelled nearer, a roll with sudden spasms of harsher sound in it, reminding me of the churning in one of the potholes of Kirkcaple cliffs. Presently it grew softer again as the sound passed south, but new notes were always emerging. The echo came sometimes, as it were, from stark rock, and sometimes from the deep gloom of the forests. I have never heard an eerier sound, neither natural nor human it seemed, but the voice of that world between which is hid from man's sight and hearing. Mr. Wardlaw clutched my arm, and in that moment I guessed the explanation. The native drums were beating, passing some message from the far north down the line of the Berg, where the locations were thickest, to the great black populations of the south. "But that means war," Mr. Wardlaw cried. "It means nothing of the kind," I said shortly. "It's their way of sending news. It's as likely to be some change in the weather, or an outbreak of cattle disease." When we got home I found Japp with a face like grey paper. "Did you hear the drums?" he asked. "Yes," I said shortly. "What about them?" "God forgive you for an ignorant Britisher," he almost shouted. "You may hear drums any night, but a drumming like that I only once heard before. It was in '79, in the Zeti Valley. Do you know what happened next day? Cetewayo's impis came over the hills, and in an hour there wasn't a living white soul in the glen. 2 men escaped, and one of them was called Peter Japp." "We are in God's hands then, and must wait on His will," I said solemnly. There was no more sleep for Wardlaw and myself that night. We made the best barricade we could of the windows, loaded all our weapons, and trusted to Colin to give us early news. Before supper I went over to get Japp to join us, but found that that worthy had sought help from his old protector, the bottle, and was already sound asleep with both door and window open. I had made up my mind that death was certain, and yet my heart belied my conviction, and I could not feel the appropriate mood. If anything, I was more cheerful since I had heard the drums. It was clearly now beyond the power of me or any man to stop the march of events. My thoughts ran on a native rising, and I kept telling myself how little that was probable. Where were the arms, the leader, the discipline? At any rate, such arguments put me to sleep before dawn, and I wakened at 8 to find that nothing had happened. The clear morning sunlight, as of old, made Blaauwildebeestefontein the place of a dream. Zeeta brought in my cup of coffee as if this day were just like all others. My pipe tasted as sweet. The fresh air from the Berg blew as fragrantly on my brow. I went over to the store in reasonably good spirits, leaving Wardlaw busy on the penitential psalms. The post runner had brought the mail as usual, and there was one private letter for me. I opened it with great excitement, for the envelope bore the stamp of the firm. At last Collis had deigned to answer. Inside was a sheet of the firm's notepaper, with the signature of Collis across the top, but someone had pencilled these 5 words: "The Blesboks are changing ground." I looked to see that Japp had not suffocated himself, then shut up the store and went back to my room to think out this new mystification. The thing had come from Collis, for it was the private notepaper of the Durban office, and there was Collis' signature, but the pencilling was in a different hand. My deduction from this was that someone wished to send me a message, and that Collis had given that someone a sheet of signed paper to serve as a kind of introduction. I might take it, therefore, that the scribble was Collis' reply to my letter. "Now," my argument continued, "if the unknown person saw fit to send me a message, it could not be merely one of warning. Collis must have told him that I was awake to some danger, and, as I was in Blaauwildebeestefontein, I must be nearer the heart of things than anyone else. The message must therefore be in the nature of some password, which I was to remember when I heard it again. I reasoned the whole thing out very clearly, and I saw no gap in my logic. I cannot describe how that scribble had heartened me. I felt no more the crushing isolation of yesterday. There were others beside me in the secret. Help must be on the way, and the letter was the first tidings. But how near? That was the question, and it occurred to me for the first time to look at the postmark. I went back to the store and got the envelope out of the wastepaper basket. The postmark was certainly not Durban. The stamp was a Cape Colony one, and of the mark I could only read three letters, TRS. This was no sort of clue, and I turned the thing over, completely baffled. Then I noticed that there was no mark of the post town of delivery. Our letters to Blaauwildebeestefontein came through Pietersdorp, and bore that mark. I compared the envelope with others. They all had a circle, and Pietersdorp in broad black letters, but this envelope had nothing except the stamp. I was still slow at detective work, and it was some minutes before the explanation flashed on me. The letter had never been posted at all. The stamp was a fake, and had been borrowed from an old envelope. There was only one way in which it could have come. It must have been put in the letter bag while the postman was on his way from Pietersdorp. My unknown friend must therefore be somewhere within 80 miles of me. I hurried off to look for the post runner, but he had started back an hour before. There was nothing for it but to wait on the coming of the unknown. That afternoon I again took Mr. Wardlaw for a walk. It is an ingrained habit of mine that I never tell anyone more of a business than is practically necessary. For months I had kept all my knowledge to myself, and breathed not a word to a soul. But I thought it my duty to tell Wardlaw about the letter, to let him see that we were not forgotten. I am afraid it did not encourage his mind. Occult messages seemed to him only the last proof of a deadly danger encompassing us, and I could not shake his opinion. We took the same road to the crown of the Berg, and I was confirmed in my suspicion that the woods were empty and the watchers gone. The place was as deserted as the bush at Umvelos'. When we reached the summit about sunset, we waited anxiously for the sound of drums. It came, as we expected, louder and more menacing than before. Wardlaw stood pinching my arm as the great tattoo swept down the escarpment and died away in the far mountains beyond the Olifants. Yet it no longer seemed to be a wall of sound, shutting us out from our kindred in the west. A message had pierced the wall. If the Blesbok were changing ground, I believed, the hunters were calling out their hounds and getting ready for the chase. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Prester John. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prester John by John Buchan. Chapter 7. Captain Arcoll tells a tale. It froze in the night, harder than was common on the Berg even in winter, and as I crossed the road next morning it was covered with rime. All my fears had gone, and my mind was strung high with expectation. 5 pencilled words may seem a small thing to build hope on, but it was enough for me, and I went about my work in the store with a reasonably light heart. One of the first things I did was to take stock of our armory. There were 5 sporting Mausers of a cheap make, 1 Mauser pistol, a Lee Speed carbine, and a little nickel-plated revolver. There was also Japp's shotgun, an old hammered breech-loader, as well as the gun I had brought out with me. There was a good supply of cartridges, including a stock for a .400 Express which could not be found. I pocketed the pistol and searched till I discovered a good sheath knife. If fighting was in prospect, I might as well look to my arms. All the morning I sat among flour and sugar, possessing my soul in as much patience as I could command. Nothing came down the white road from the west. The sun melted the rime. The flies came out and buzzed in the window. Japp got himself out of bed and brewed strong coffee, and went back to his slumbers. Presently it was dinner time, and I went over to a silent meal with Wardlaw. When I returned I must have fallen asleep over a pipe, for the next thing I knew I was blinking drowsily at the patch of sun in the door and listening for footsteps. In the dead stillness of the afternoon I thought I could discern a shuffling in the dust. I got up and looked out, and there, sure enough, was someone coming down the road. But it was only a Kaffir, and a miserable looking object at that. I had never seen such an anatomy. It was a very old man, bent almost double, and clad in a ragged shirt and a pair of foul khaki trousers. He carried an iron pot, and a few belongings were tied up in a dirty handkerchief. He must have been a Dacca smoker, for he coughed hideously, twisting his body with the paroxysms. I had seen the type before, the old broken down native who had no kin to support him and no tribe to shelter him. They wander about the roads, cooking their wretched meals by their little fires, till one morning they are found stiff under a bush. The native gave me good day in Kaffir, then begged for tobacco or a handful of mealie meal. I asked him where he came from. From the west, Inkoos, he said, and before that from the south. It is a sore road for old bones. I went into the store to fetch some meal, and when I came out he had shuffled close to the door. He had kept his eyes on the ground, but now he looked up at me, and I thought he had very bright eyes for such an old wreck. "The nights are cold, Inkoos," he wailed, "and my folk are scattered, and I have no kraal. The aasvogels follow me, and I can hear the blesbok." "What about the blesbok?" I asked with a start. "The blesbok are changing ground," he said, and looked me straight in the face. "And where are the hunters?" I asked. "They are here, and behind me," he said in English, holding out his pot for my meal, while he began to edge into the middle of the road. I followed, and speaking English asked him if he knew of a man called Colles. "I come from him, young boss." "Where is your house?" "Ah, the school. There will be a way in by the back window? See that it is open, for I'll be there shortly." Then lifting up his voice he called down in Sesuto all manner of blessings on me for my kindness, and went shuffling down the sunlit road, coughing like a volcano. In high excitement I locked up the store and went over to Mr. Wardlaw. No children had come to school that day, and he was sitting idle, playing patience. "Lock the door," I said, "and come into my room. We're on the brink of explanations." In about 20 minutes the bush below the back window parted and the Kaffir slipped out. He grinned at me and after a glance round hopped very nimbly over the sill. Then he examined the window and pulled the curtains. "Is the outer door shut?" he asked in excellent English. "Well, get me some hot water, and any spare clothes you may possess, Mr. Crawfurd. I must get comfortable before we begin our indaba. We've the night before us, so there's plenty of time. But get the house clear, and see that nobody disturbs me at my toilet." I am a modest man, and sensitive about my looks. I brought him what he wanted, and looked on at an amazing transformation. Taking a phial from his bundle, he rubbed some liquid on his face and neck and hands, and got rid of the black colouring. His body and legs he left untouched, save that he covered them with shirt and trousers from my wardrobe. Then he pulled off a scaly wig, and showed beneath it a head of close-cropped grizzled hair. In 10 minutes the old Kaffir had been transformed into an active, soldierly-looking man of maybe 50 years. Mr. Wardlaw stared as if he had seen a resurrection. "I had better introduce myself," he said, when he had taken the edge off his thirst and hunger. "My name is Arcoll, Captain James Arcoll. I am speaking to Mr. Crawfurd, the storekeeper, and Mr. Wardlaw, the schoolmaster of Blaauwildebeestefontein. Where, by the way, is Mr. Peter Japp? Drunk? Ah, yes, it was always his failing. The quorum, however, is complete without him." By this time it was about sunset, and I remember I cocked my ear to hear the drums beat. Captain Arcoll noticed the movement as he noticed all else. "You're listening for the drums, but you won't hear them. That business is over here. Tonight they beat in Swaziland and down into the Tonga border. 3 days more, unless you and I, Mr. Crawfurd, are extra smart, and they'll be hearing them in Durban." It was not till the lamp was lit, the fire burning well, and the house locked and shuttered, that Captain Arcoll began his tale. "First," he said, "let me hear what you know. Colles told me that you were a keen fellow, and had wind of some mystery here. You wrote him about the way you were spied on, but I told him to take no notice. Your affair, Mr. Crawfurd, had to wait on more urgent matters. Now, what do you think is happening?" I spoke very shortly, weighing my words, for I felt I was on trial before these bright eyes. "I think that some kind of native rising is about to commence." "Ay," he said dryly, "you would, and your evidence would be the spying and drumming. Anything more?" "I have come on the tracks of a lot of IDB work in the neighbourhood. The natives have some supply of diamonds, which they sell bit by bit, and I don't doubt but they have been getting guns with the proceeds." He nodded. "Have you any notion who has been engaged in the job?" I had it on my tongue to mention Japp, but forbore, remembering my promise. "I can name one," I said. a little yellow Portugoose who calls himself Henriques or Hendricks. He passed by here the day before yesterday." Captain Arcoll suddenly was consumed with quiet laughter. "Did you notice the Kaffir who rode with him and carried his saddlebags? Well, he's one of my men. Henriques would have a fit if he knew what was in those saddlebags. They contain my change of clothes and other odds and ends. Henriques' own stuff is in a hole in the spruit. A handy way of getting one's luggage sent on, eh? The bags are waiting for me at a place I appointed." And again Captain Arcoll indulged his sense of humour. Then he became grave and returned to his examination. "A rising, with diamonds as the sinews of war, and Henriques as the chief agent. Well and good, but who is to lead, and what are the natives going to rise about? I know nothing further, but I have made some guesses." "Let's hear your guesses," he said, blowing smoke rings from his pipe. "I think the main mover is a great black minister who calls himself John Laputa." Captain Arcoll nearly sprang out of his chair. "Now how on earth did you find that out? Quick, Mr. Crawfurd, tell me all you know, for this is desperately important." I began at the beginning, and told him the story of what happened on the Kirkcaple shore. Then I spoke of my sight of him on board ship, his talk with Henriques about Blaauwildebeestefontein, and his hurried departure from Durban. Captain Arcoll listened intently, and at the mention of Durban he laughed. "You and I seem to have been running on lines which nearly touched. I thought I had grabbed my friend Laputa that night in Durban, but I was too cocksure and he slipped off. Do you know, Mr. Crawfurd, you have been on the right trail long before me. When did you say you first saw him at his devil worship? 7 years ago? Then you were the first man alive to know the Reverend John in his true colours. You knew 7 years ago what I only found out last year." "Well, that's my story," I said. "I don't know what the rising is about, but there's one other thing I can tell you. There is some kind of sacred place for the Kaffirs, and I've found out where it is." I gave him a short account of my adventures in the Rooirand. He smoked silently for a bit after I had finished. "You've got the skeleton of the whole thing right, and you only want the filling up. And you found out everything for yourself. Collis was right. You're not wanting in intelligence, Mr. Crawfurd." It was not much of a compliment, but I have never been more pleased in my life. This slim, grizzled man with his wrinkled face and bright eyes was clearly not lavish in his praise. I felt it was no small thing to have earned a word of commendation. "And now I will tell you my story," said Captain Arcoll. "It is a long story, and I must begin far back. It has taken me years to decipher it, and remember, I've been all my life at this native business. I can talk every dialect, and I have the customs of every tribe by heart. I've travelled over every mile of South Africa, and Central and East Africa too. I was in both the Matabele wars, and I've seen a heap of other fighting which never got into the papers. So what I tell you, you can take as gospel, for it is knowledge that was not learned in a day." He puffed away and then asked suddenly, "Did you ever hear of Prester John?" "The man that lived in Central Asia?" I asked, with a reminiscence of a storybook I had as a boy. "No, no," said Mr. Wardlaw. "He means the King of Abyssinia in the 15th century. I've been reading all about him. He was a Christian, and the Portuguese sent expedition after expedition to find him, but they never got there. Albuquerque wanted to make an alliance with him and capture the Holy Sepulchre." Arcoll nodded. "That's the one I mean. There's not very much known about him, except Portuguese legends. He was a sort of Christian, but I expect that his practices were as pagan as his neighbours. There is no doubt that he was a great conqueror. Under him and his successors the empire of Ethiopia extended far south of Abyssinia, away down to the Great Lakes." "How long did this power last?" I asked, wondering to what tale this was prologue. "That's a mystery no scholar has ever been able to fathom. Anyhow, the centre of authority began to shift southward, and the warrior tribes moved in that direction. At the end of the 16th century the chief native power was round about the Zambesi. The Mazimba and the Makaranga had come down from the Lake Nyassa quarter, and there was a strong kingdom in Manicaland. That was the Monomotapa that the Portuguese thought so much of." Wardlaw nodded eagerly. The story was getting into ground that he knew about. "The thing to remember is that all these little empires thought themselves the successors of Prester John. It took me a long time to find this out, and I've spent days in the best libraries in Europe over it. They all looked back to a great king in the north, whom they called by about 20 different names. They had forgotten all about his Christianity, but they remembered that he was a conqueror. Well, to make a long story short, Monomotapa disappeared in time, and fresh tribes came down from the north, and pushed right down to Natal and the Cape. That is how the Zulus first appeared. They brought with them the story of Prester John, but by this time it had ceased to be a historical memory, and had become a religious cult. They worshipped a great power who had been their ancestor, and the favourite Zulu word for him was Umkulunkulu. The belief was perverted into 50 different forms, but this was the central creed, that Umkulunkulu had been the father of the tribe, and was alive as a spirit to watch over them. They brought more than a creed with them. Somehow or other, some fetish had descended from Prester John by way of the Mzimba and Angoni and Makaranga. What it is I do not know, but it was always in the hands of the tribe which for the moment held the leadership. The great native wars of the 16th century, which you can read about in the Portuguese historians, were not for territory, but for leadership, and mainly for the possession of this fetish. Anyhow, we know that the Zulus brought it down with them. They called it Ndhlondhlo, which means the great snake, but I don't suppose that it was any kind of snake. The snake was their totem, and they would naturally call their most sacred possession after it. Now I will tell you a thing that few know. You have heard of Shaka. He was a sort of Black Napoleon early in the last century, and he made the Zulus the paramount power in South Africa, slaughtering about 2 million souls to accomplish it. Well, he had the fetish, whatever it was, and it was believed that he owed his conquests to it. Mozilakatsa tried to steal it, and that was why he had to fly to Matabeleland. But with Shaka it disappeared. Dingaan did not have it, nor Panda, and Cetewayo never got it, though he searched the length and breadth of the country for it. It had gone out of existence, and with it the chance of a Kaffir empire. Captain Arcoll got up to light his pipe, and I noticed that his face was grave. He was not telling us this yarn for our amusement. So much for Prester John and his charm, he said. Now I have to take up the history at a different point. In spite of risings here and there, and occasional rows, the Kaffirs have been quiet for the better part of half a century. It is no credit to us. They have had plenty of grievances, and we are no nearer understanding them than our fathers were. But they are scattered and divided. We have driven great wedges of white settlements into their territory, and we have taken away their arms. Still, they are 6 times as many as we are, and they have long memories, and a thoughtful man may wonder how long the peace will last. I have often asked myself that question, and till lately I used to reply, forever, because they cannot find a leader with the proper authority, and they have no common cause to fight for. But a year or 2 ago I began to change my mind. It is my business to act as chief intelligence officer among the natives. Well, one day I came on the tracks of a curious person. He was a Christian minister called Laputa, and he was going among the tribes from Durban to the Zambesi as a roving evangelist. I found that he made an enormous impression, and yet the people I spoke to were chary of saying much about him. Presently I found that he preached more than the gospel. His word was Africa for the Africans, and his chief point was that the natives had had a great empire in the past, and might have a great empire again. He used to tell the story of Prester John with all kinds of embroidery of his own. You see, Prester John was a good argument for him, for he had been a Christian as well as a great potentate. For years there has been plenty of this talk in South Africa, chiefly among Christian Kaffirs. It is what they call Ethiopianism, and American Negroes are the chief apostles. For myself, I always thought the thing perfectly harmless. I don't care a fig whether the native missions break away from the parent churches in England and call themselves by fancy names. The more freedom they have in their religious life, the less they are likely to think about politics. But I soon found out that Laputa was none of your flabby educated Negroes from America, and I began to watch him. I first came across him at a revival meeting in London where he was a great success. He came and spoke to me about my soul, but he gave up when I dropped into Zulu. The next time I met him was on the lower Limpopo, when I had the honour of trying to shoot him from a boat." Captain Arcoll took his pipe from his mouth and laughed at the recollection. "I had got on to an I.D.B. gang, and to my amazement found the evangelist among them. But the Reverend John was too much for me. He went overboard in spite of the crocodiles, and managed to swim below water to the reed bed at the side. However, that was a valuable experience for me, for it gave me a clue. I next saw him at a missionary conference in Cape Town, and after that at a meeting of the Geographical Society in London, where I had a long talk with him. My reputation does not follow me home, and he thought I was an English publisher with an interest in missions. You see, I had no evidence to connect him with I.D.B., and besides I fancied that his real game was something bigger than that, so I just bided my time and watched. I did my best to get on to his dossier, but it was no easy job. However, I found out a few things. He had been educated in the States, and well educated too, for the man is a good scholar and a great reader, besides the finest natural orator I have ever heard. There was no doubt that he was of Zulu blood, but I could get no traces of his family. He must come of high stock, for he is a fine figure of a man. Very soon I found it was no good following him in his excursions into civilization. There he was merely the educated Kaffir, a great pet of missionary societies, and a favourite speaker at church meetings. You will find evidence given by him in blue books on native affairs, and he counted many members of Parliament at home among his correspondents. I let that side go, and resolved to dog him when on his evangelizing tours in the Backveld. For 6 months I stuck to him like a leech. I am pretty good at disguises, and he never knew who was the broken down old Kaffir who squatted in the dirt at the edge of the crowd when he spoke, or the half-caste who called him sir and drove his Cape cart. I had some queer adventures, but these can wait. The gist of the thing is that after 6 months, which turned my hair grey, I got a glimmering of what he was after. He talked Christianity to the mobs in the kraals, but to the indunas he told a different story. Captain Arcoll helped himself to a drink. You can guess what that story was, Mr. Crawford. At full moon, when the black cock was blooded, the Reverend John forgot his Christianity. He was back 4 centuries among the Mazimba, sweeping down on the Zambesi. He told them, and they believed him, that he was the Mkulunkulu, the incarnated spirit of Prester John. He told them that he was there to lead the African race to conquest and empire. Aye, and he told them more, for he has, or says he has, the great snake itself, the necklet of Prester John. Neither of us spoke. We were too occupied with fitting this news into our chain of knowledge. Captain Arcoll went on. Now that I knew his purpose, I set myself to find out his preparations. It was not long before I found a mighty organization at work from the Zambesi to the Cape. The great tribes were up to their necks in the conspiracy, and all manner of little sects had been taken in. I have sat at tribal councils and been sworn a blood brother, and I have used the secret password to get knowledge in odd places. It was a dangerous game, and as I have said, I had my adventures, but I came safe out of it, with my knowledge. The first thing I found out was that there was a great deal of wealth somewhere among the tribes. Much of it was in diamonds, which the labourers stole from the mines and the chiefs impounded. Nearly every tribe had its secret chest, and our friend Laputa had the use of them all. Of course the difficulty was changing the diamonds into coin, and he had to start I.D.B. on a big scale. Your pal Henriques was the chief agent for this, but he had others at Mozambique and Johannesburg, aye, and in London, whom I have on my list. With the money, guns and ammunition were bought, and it seems that a pretty flourishing trade has been going on for some time. They came in mostly overland, through Portuguese territory, though there have been cases of consignments to Johannesburg houses, the contents of which did not correspond with the invoice. You ask what the governments were doing to let this go on. Yes, and you may well ask. They were all asleep. They never dreamed of danger from the natives, and in any case it was difficult to police the Portuguese side. Laputa knew our weakness, and he staked everything on it. My first scheme was to lay Laputa by the heels, but no government would act on my information. The man was strongly buttressed by public support at home, and South Africa has burned her fingers before this with arbitrary arrests. Then I tried to fasten IDB on him, but I could not get my proofs till too late. I nearly had him in Durban, but he got away, and he never gave me a second chance. For 5 months he and Henriques have been lying low, because their scheme was getting very ripe. I have been following them through Zululand and Gazaland, and I have discovered that the train is ready, and only wants the match. For a month I have never been more than 5 hours behind him on the trail, and if he has laid his train, I have laid mine also." Arcoll's whimsical, humorous face had hardened into grimness, and in his clear eyes there was the light of a fierce purpose. The sight of him comforted me in spite of his tale. "But what can he hope to do?" I asked. "Though he roused every Kaffir in South Africa, he would be beaten." "You say he is an educated man. He must know that he has no chance in the long run." "I said he was an educated man, but he is also a Kaffir. He can see the first stage of a thing, and maybe the second, but no more. That is the native mind. If it was not like that, our chance would be the worse." "You say the scheme is ripe," I said. "How ripe?" Arcoll looked at the clock. "In half an hour's time Laputa will be with Mpefu. There he will stay the night. Tomorrow morning he goes to Umvelos' to meet Henriques. Tomorrow evening the gathering begins." "One question," I said. "How big a man is Laputa?" "The biggest thing the Kaffirs have ever produced. I tell you, in my opinion, he is a great genius. If he had been white he might have been a second Napoleon. He is a born leader of men, and as brave as a lion. There is no villainy he would not do if necessary, and yet I should hesitate to call him a blackguard. Ay, you may look surprised at me, you two pragmatical Scotsmen, but I have, so to speak, lived with the man for months, and there's fineness and nobility in him. He would be a terrible enemy, but a just one. He has the heart of a poet and a king, and it is God's curse that he has been born among the children of Ham. I hope to shoot him like a dog in a day or two, but I am glad to bear testimony to his greatness." "If the rising starts tomorrow," I asked, "have you any of his plans?" He picked up a map from the table and opened it. "The first rendezvous is somewhere near Sikitolas. Then they move south, picking up contingents, and the final concentration is to be on the high veld near Amsterdam, which is convenient for the Swazis and the Zulus. After that I know nothing, but of course there are local concentrations along the whole line of the Berg from Mashonaland to Basutoland. Now look here. To get to Amsterdam they must cross the Delagoa Bay Railway. Well, they won't be allowed to. If they get as far they will be scattered there. As I told you, I too have laid my train. We have the police ready all along the scarp of the Berg. Every exit from native territory is watched, and the frontier farmers are out on commando. We have regulars on the Delagoa Bay and Natal lines, and a system of field telegraphs laid which can summon further troops to any point. It has all been kept secret because we are still in the dark ourselves. The newspaper public knows nothing about any rising, but in 2 days every white household in South Africa will be in a panic. Make no mistake, Mr. Crawfurd, this is a grim business. We will smash Laputa and his men, but it will be a fierce fight, and there will be much good blood shed. Besides, it will throw the country back another half-century. Would to God I had been man enough to put a bullet through his head in cold blood. But I could not do it. It was too like murder, and maybe I shall never have the chance now." "There's one thing puzzles me," I said. "What makes Laputa come up here to start with? Why didn't he begin with Zululand?" "God knows. There's sure to be sense in it, for he does nothing without reason. We may know tomorrow." But as Captain Arcoll spoke, the real reason suddenly flashed into my mind. Laputa had to get the Great Snake, the necklet of Prester John, to give his leadership prestige. Apparently he had not yet got it, or Arcoll would have known. He started from this neighbourhood because the fetish was somewhere hereabouts. I was convinced that my guess was right, but I kept my own counsel. "Tomorrow Laputa and Henriques meet at Umvelos', probably at your new store, Mr. Crawfurd." and so the ball commences." My resolution was suddenly taken. I think I said I had better be present at the meeting, as representing the firm. Captain Arcoll stared at me and laughed. "I had thought of going myself," he said. "Then you go to certain death, disguise yourself as you please. You cannot meet them in the store as I can. I'm there on my ordinary business, and they will never suspect. If you're to get any news, I'm the man to go." He looked at me steadily for a minute or so. "I'm not sure that's such a bad idea of yours. I would be better employed myself on the Berg, and as you say, I would have little chance of hearing anything. You're a plucky fellow, Mr. Crawfurd. I suppose you understand that the risk is pretty considerable." "I suppose I do, but since I'm in this thing I may as well see it out. Besides, I've an old quarrel with our friend Laputa." "Good and well," said Captain Arcoll. "Draw in your chair to the table then, and I'll explain to you the disposition of my men. I should tell you that I have loyal natives in my pay in most tribes, and can count on early intelligence. We can't match their telepathy, but the new type of field telegraph is not so bad, and may be a trifle more reliable." Till midnight we pored over maps, and certain details were burned on my memory. Then we went to bed and slept soundly, even Mr. Wardlaw. It was strange how fear had gone from the establishment, now that we knew the worst and had a fighting man by our side. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Prester John. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prester John by John Buchan. Chapter 8. I Fall In Again with the Reverend John Laputa. Once as a boy I had earnestly desired to go into the army, and had hopes of rising to be a great general. Now that I know myself better, I do not think I would have been much good at a general's work. I would have shirked the loneliness of it, the isolation of responsibility. But I think I would have done well in a subaltern command, for I had a great notion of carrying out orders, and a certain zest in the mere act of obedience. 3 days before I had been as nervous as a kitten, because I was alone and it was "up to me," as Americans say, to decide on the next step. But now that I was only one wheel in a great machine of defence, my nervousness seemed to have fled. I was well aware that the mission I was bound on was full of risk, but to my surprise I felt no fear. Indeed, I had much the same feeling as a boy on a Saturday's holiday who has planned a great expedition. One thing only I regretted, that Tam Dyke was not with me to see the fun. The thought of that faithful soul, now beating somewhere on the seas, made me long for his comradeship. As I shaved, I remembered wondering if I would ever shave again, and the thought gave me no tremors. For once in my sober life I was strung up to the gambler's pitch of adventure. My job was to go to Umvelos' as if on my ordinary business, and if possible find out something of the evening's plan of march. The question was how to send back a message to Arcoll, assuming I had any difficulty in getting away. At first this puzzled us both, and then I thought of Colin. I had trained the dog to go home at my bidding, for often, when I used to go hunting, I would have occasion to visit a kraal where he would have been a nuisance. Accordingly, I resolved to take Colin with me, and if I got into trouble, to send word by him. I asked about Laputa's knowledge of our preparations. Arcoll was inclined to think that he suspected little. The police and the commandos had been kept very secret, and besides, they were moving on the high veld and out of the ken of the tribes. Natives, he told me, were not good scouts so far as white man's work was concerned, for they did not understand the meaning of what we did. On the other hand, his native scouts brought him pretty accurate tidings of any Kaffir movements. He thought that all the bush country of the plain would be closely watched, and that no one would get through without some kind of pass. But he thought also that the storekeeper might be an exception, for his presence would give rise to no suspicions. Almost his last words to me were to come back hell for leather if I saw the game was hopeless, and in any case to leave as soon as I got any news. "If you're there when the march begins," he said, "they'll cut your throat for a certainty." I had all the various police posts on the Berg clear in my mind, so that I would know where to make for if the road to Blaauwildebeestefontein should be closed. I said good-bye to Arcoll and Wardlaw with a light heart, though the schoolmaster broke down and implored me to think better of it. As I turned down into the gorge I heard the sound of horses' feet far behind, and turning back, saw white riders dismounting at the dorp. At any rate, I was leaving the country well guarded in my rear. It was a fine morning in midwinter, and I was in very good spirits as I jogged on my pony down the steep hill road, with Colin running beside me. A month before I had taken the same journey, with no suspicion in my head of what the future was to bring. I thought about my Dutch companions, now with their cattle far out on the plains. Did they know of the great danger, I wondered? All the way down the glen I saw no sign of human presence. The game birds mocked me from the thicket. A brace of white berghaan circled far up in the blue, and I had for pleasant comrade the brawling river. I dismounted once to drink, and in that green haven of flowers and ferns I was struck sharply with a sense of folly. Here were we wretched creatures of men, making for each other's throats, and outraging the good earth which God had made so fair a habitation. I had resolved on a short cut to Umvelos', avoiding the neighbourhood of Sikitola's kraal. So when the river emerged from the glen, I crossed it and struck into the bush. I had not gone far before I realised that something strange was going on. It was like the woods on the Berg a week before. I had the impression of many people moving in the bush, and now and then I caught a glimpse of them. My first thought was that I should be stopped, but soon it appeared that these folk had business of their own which did not concern me. I was conscious of being watched, yet it was clear that the bush folk were not there for the purpose of watching me. For a little I kept my spirits, but as the hours passed with the same uncanny hurrying to and fro all about me, my nerves began to suffer. Weeks of espionage at Blaauwildebeestefontein had made me jumpy. These people apparently meant me no ill, and had no time to spare on me, but the sensation of moving through them was like walking on a black dark night with precipices all around. I felt odd quiverings between my shoulder blades, where a spear might be expected to lodge. Overhead was a great blue sky and a blazing sun, and I could see the path running clear before me between the walls of scrub. But it was like midnight to me, a midnight of suspicion and unknown perils. I began to wish heartily I had never come. I stopped for my midday meal at a place called Taki, a grassy glade in the bush where a tiny spring of water crept out from below a big stone, only to disappear in the sand. Here I sat and smoked for half an hour, wondering what was going to become of me. The air was very still, but I could hear the rustle of movement somewhere within 100 yards. The hidden folk were busy about their own ends, and I regretted that I had not taken the road by Sikitola's and seen how the kraals looked. They must be empty now, for the young men were already out on some mission. So nervous I got that I took my pocketbook and wrote down certain messages to my mother, which I implored whoever should find my body to transmit. Then, a little ashamed of my childishness, I pulled myself together and remounted. About 3 in the afternoon I came over a low ridge of bush and saw the corrugated iron roof of the store and the gleam of water from the Labongo. The sight encouraged me, for at any rate it meant the end of this disquieting ride. Here the bush changed to trees of some size, and after leaving the ridge the road plunged for a little into a thick shade. I had forgotten for a moment the folk in the bush, and when a man stepped out of the thicket I pulled up my horse with a start. It was a tall native who carried himself proudly, and after a glance at me, stalked along at my side. He wore curious clothes, for he had a kind of linen tunic, and around his waist hung a kilt of leopard skin. In such a man one would have looked for a ringkop, but instead he had a mass of hair, not like a Kaffir's wool, but long and curled like some popular musician's. I should have been prepared for the face, but the sight of it sent a sudden chill of fright through my veins. for there were the curved nose, the deep flashing eyes, and the cruel lips of my enemy of the Kirkcaple shore. Colin was deeply suspicious and followed his heels growling, but he never turned his head. "The day is warm, father," I said in Kaffir. "Do you go far?" He slackened pace till he was at my elbow. "But a short way, boss," he replied in English. "I go to the store yonder." "Well met, then," said I, "for I am the storekeeper. You will find little in it, for it is newly built and not yet stocked. I have ridden over to see to it." He turned his face to me. "That is bad news. I had hoped for food and drink yonder. I have travelled far, and in the chill nights I desire a cover for my head. Will the boss allow me to sleep the night in an outhouse?" By this time I had recovered my nerve, and was ready to play the part I had determined on. "Willingly," I said. "You may sleep in the storeroom if you care. You will find sacks for bedding, and the place is snug enough on a cold night." He thanked me with a grave dignity which I had never seen in any Kaffir. As my eye fell on his splendid proportions, I forgot all else in my admiration of the man. In his minister's clothes he had looked only a heavily built native, but now in his savage dress I saw how noble a figure he made. He must have been at least 6 feet and a half, but his chest was so deep and his shoulders so massive that one did not remark his height. He put a hand on my saddle, and I remember noting how slim and fine it was, more like a high bred woman's than a man's. Curiously enough, he filled me with a certain confidence. "I do not think you will cut my throat," I said to myself. "Your game is too big for common murder." The store at Umvelos' stood as I had left it. There was the sjambok I had forgotten, still lying on the window sill. I unlocked the door, and a stifling smell of new paint came out to meet me. Inside there was nothing but the chairs and benches, and in a corner the pots and pans I had left against my next visit. I unlocked the cupboard and got out a few stores, opened the windows of the bedroom next door, and flung my kaross on the cartel which did duty as bed. Then I went out to find Laputa standing patiently in the sunshine. I showed him the outhouse where I had said he might sleep. It was the largest room in the store, but wholly unfurnished. A pile of barrels and packing cases stood in the corner, and there was enough sacking to make a sort of bed. "I am going to make tea," I said. "If you have come far, you would maybe like a cup?" He thanked me, and I made a fire in the grate and put on the kettle to boil. Then I set on the table biscuits and sardines and a pot of jam. It was my business now to play the fool, and I believe I succeeded to admiration in the part. I blush today to think of the stuff I talked. First I made him sit on a chair opposite me, a thing no white man in the country would have done. Then I told him affectionately that I liked natives, that they were fine fellows and better men than the dirty whites round about. I explained that I was fresh from England and believed in equal rights for all men, white or coloured. "I think," I said, "I hoped to see the day when Africa would belong once more to its rightful masters." He heard me with an impassive face, his grave eyes studying every line of me. I am bound to add that he made a hearty meal, and drank 3 cups of strong tea of my brewing. I gave him a cigar, one of a lot I had got from a Dutch farmer who was experimenting with their manufacture, and all the while I babbled of myself and my opinions. He must have thought me half-witted, and indeed before long I began to be of the same opinion myself. I told him that I meant to sleep the night here, and go back in the morning to Blaauwildebeestefontein, and then to Pietersdorp for stores. By and by I could see that he had ceased to pay any attention to what I said. I was clearly set down in his mind as a fool. Instead, he kept looking at Colin, who was lying blinking in the doorway, one wary eye cocked on the stranger. "You have a fine dog," he observed. "Yes," I agreed, with one final effort of mendacity. "He's fine to look at, but he has no grit in him. Any mongrel from a kraal can make him turn tail. Besides, he is a born fool and can't find his way home. I'm thinking of getting rid of him." Laputa rose, and his eye fell on the dog's back. I could see that he saw the lie of the coat, and that he did not agree with me. "The food was welcome, Baas," he said. "If you will listen to me I can repay hospitality with advice. You are a stranger here. Trouble comes, and if you are wise you will go back to the Berg." "I don't know what you mean," I said, with an air of cheerful idiocy. "But back to the Berg I go, the first thing in the morning. I hate these stinking plains." "It were wise to go tonight," he said, with a touch of menace in his tone. "I can't," I said, and began to sing the chorus of a ridiculous music hall song. "There's no place like home, but I'm afraid to go home in the dark." Laputa shrugged his shoulders, stepped over the bristling Colin, and went out. When I looked after him 2 minutes later, he had disappeared. Chapter 9 of Prester John. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prester John by John Buchan. Chapter 9. The Store at Umvelos'. I sat down on a chair and laboured to collect my thoughts. Laputa had gone and would return sooner or later with Henriques. If I was to remain alive till morning, both of them must be convinced that I was harmless. Laputa was probably of this opinion, but Henriques would recognize me, and I had no wish to have that yellow miscreant investigating my character. There was only one way out of it. I must be incapably drunk. There was not a drop of liquor in the store, but I found an old whisky bottle half full of methylated spirits. With this I thought I might raise an atmosphere of bad whisky, and for the rest I must trust to my meagre gifts as an actor. Supposing I escaped suspicion, Laputa and Henriques would meet in the outhouse, and I must find some means of overhearing them. Here I was fairly baffled. There was no window in the outhouse save in the roof, and they were sure to shut and bolt the door. I might conceal myself among the barrels inside, but apart from the fact that they were likely to search them before beginning their conference, it was quite certain that they would satisfy themselves that I was safe in the other end of the building before going to the outhouse. Suddenly I thought of the cellar which we had built below the store. There was an entrance by a trap door behind the counter, and another in the outhouse. I had forgotten the details, but my hope was that the second was among the barrels. I shut the outer door, prized up the trap, and dropped into the vault, which had been floored roughly with green bricks. Lighting match after match, I crawled to the other end and tried to lift the door. It would not stir, so I guessed that the barrels were on top of it. Back to the outhouse I went, and found that sure enough a heavy packing case was standing on a corner. I fixed it slightly open, so as to let me hear, and so arranged the odds and ends round about it that no one looking from the floor of the outhouse would guess at its existence. It occurred to me that the conspirators would want seats, so I placed 2 cases at the edge of the heap, that they might not be tempted to forage in the interior. This done, I went back to the store, and proceeded to rig myself out for my part. The cellar had made me pretty dirty, and I added some new daubs to my face. My hair had grown longish, and I ran my hands through it till it stood up like a cockatoo's crest. Then I cunningly disposed the methylated spirits in the places most likely to smell. I burned a little on the floor, I spilt some on the counter and on my hands, and I let it dribble over my coat. In 5 minutes I had made the room stink like a shebeen. I loosened the collar of my shirt, and when I looked at myself in the cover of my watch, I saw a specimen of debauchery which would have done credit to a Saturday night's police cell. By this time the sun had gone down, but I thought it better to kindle no light. It was the night of the full moon, for which reason I supposed Laputa had selected it, and in an hour or two the world would be lit with that ghostly radiance. I sat on the counter while the minutes passed, and I confess I found the time of waiting very trying for my courage. I had got over my worst nervousness by having something to do, but whenever I was idle my fears returned. Laputa had a big night's work before him, and must begin soon. My vigil, I told myself, could not be long. My pony was stalled in a rough shed we had built opposite the store. I could hear him shaking his head and stamping the ground above the croaking of the frogs by the Labongo. Presently it seemed to me that another sound came from behind the store, the sound of horses' feet and the rattle of bridles. It was hushed for a moment, and then I heard human voices. The riders had tied up their horses to a tree and were coming nearer. I sprawled gracefully on the counter, the empty bottle in my hand, and my eyes fixed anxiously on the square of the door, which was filled with the blue glimmer of the late twilight. The square darkened and two men peered in. Colin growled from below the counter, but with one hand I held the scruff of his neck. "Hullo," I said. "Ish that my black friend? Awfully shorry, old man, but I've fnished the whisky, the bottle shempty," and I waved it upside down with an imbecile giggle. Laputa said something which I did not catch. Henriques laughed an ugly laugh. "We had better make certain of him," he said. The two argued for a minute, and then Laputa seemed to prevail. The door was shut, and the key, which I had left in the lock, turned on me. I gave them 5 minutes to get to the outhouse and settle to business. Then I opened the trap, got into the cellar, and crawled to the other end. A ray of light was coming through the partially raised door. By a blessed chance some old bricks had been left behind, and of these I made a footstool, which enabled me to get my back level with the door and look out. My lager of barrels was intact, but through a gap I had left I could see the two men sitting on the two cases I had provided for them. A lantern was set between them, and Henriques was drinking out of a metal flask. He took something, I could not see what, out of his pocket and held it before his companion. "Spoils of war," he said. "I let Sikitola's men draw first blood. They needed it to screw up their courage. Now they are as wild as Umbooni's." Laputa asked a question. It was the Dutchmen, who were out on the Kudu flats with their cattle. "Man, it's no good being squeamish. Do you think you can talk over these surly backveld fools? If we had not done it, the best of their horses would now be over the Berg to give warning. Besides, I tell you, Sikitola's men wanted blooding. I did for the old swine Coetzee with my own hands. Once he set his dogs at me, and I don't forget an injury." Laputa must have disapproved, for Henriques' voice grew high. "Run the show the way you please," he cried, "but don't blame me if you make a hash of it. God, man, do you think you are going to work a revolution on skim milk? If I had my will, I would go in and stick a knife in the drunken hog next door." "He is safe enough," Laputa replied. "I gave him the chance of life, and he laughed at me. He won't get far on his road home." This was pleasant hearing for me, but I scarcely thought of myself. I was consumed with a passion of fury against that murdering yellow devil. With Laputa I was not angry. He was an open enemy, playing a fair game. But my fingers itched to get at the Portugoose, that double-dyed traitor to his race. As I thought of my kindly old friends, lying butchered with their kinfolk out in the bush, hot tears of rage came to my eyes. "Perfect love casteth out fear," the Bible says, but to speak it reverently, so does perfect hate. Not for safety and a king's ransom would I have drawn back from the game. I prayed for one thing only, that God in his mercy would give me the chance of settling with Henriques. I fancy I missed some of the conversation, being occupied with my own passion. At any rate, when I next listened, the two were deep in plans. Maps were spread beside them, and Laputa's delicate forefinger was tracing a route. I strained my ears but could catch only a few names. Apparently they were to keep in the plains till they had crossed the Klein Labongo and the Letaba. I thought I caught the name of the ford of the latter. It sounded like Dupree's Drift. After that the talk became plainer, for Laputa was explaining in his clear voice. The force would leave the bush, ascend the Berg by the glen of the Groot Letaba, and the first halt would be called at a place called Inanda's Kraal, where a promontory of the high veld juts out behind the peaks called the Volkberg. or Cloud Mountains. All this was very much to the point, and the names sunk into my memory like a die into wax. "Meanwhile," said Laputa, "there is the gathering at Ntaba Kaikonjwa. It will take us 3 hours' hard riding to get there." Where on earth was Ntaba Kaikonjwa? It must be the native name for the Rooirand, for after all Laputa was not likely to use the Dutch word for his own sacred place. Nothing has been forgotten. The men are massed below the cliffs, and the chiefs and the great Indunas will enter the place of the Snake. The door will be guarded, and only the password will get a man through. That word is Emmanuel, which means God with us. "Well, when we get there, what happens?" Henriques asked with a laugh. "What kind of magic will you spring on us?" There was a strong contrast between the flippant tone of the Portugoose and the grave voice which answered him. "The Keeper of the Snake will open the holy place and bring forth the Isetembiso Sami. As the leader of my people, I will assume the collar of Umkulankulu in the name of our God and the spirits of the great dead." "But you don't propose to lead the march in a necklace of rubies?" said Henriques with a sudden eagerness in his voice. Again Laputa spoke gravely, and as it were abstractedly. I heard the voice of one whose mind was fixed on a far horizon. "When I am acclaimed king, I restore the Snake to its keeper, and swear never to clasp it on my neck till I have led my people to victory." "I see," said Henriques. "What about the purification you mentioned?" I had missed this before, and listened earnestly. "The vows we take in the holy place bind us till we are purged of them at Inanda's Kraal. Till then no blood must be shed, and no flesh eaten. It was the fashion of our forefathers." "Well, I think you've taken on a pretty risky job," Henriques said. "You propose to travel 100 miles, binding yourself not to strike a blow. It is simply putting yourself at the mercy of any police patrol." "There will be no patrol," Laputa replied. "Our march will be as secret and as swift as death. I have made my preparations." "But suppose you met with opposition?" the Portugoose persisted. "Would the rule hold?" "If any try to stop us, we shall tie them hand and foot and carry them with us. Their fate will be worse than if they had been slain in battle." "I see," said Henriques, whistling through his teeth. "Well, before we start this vow business, I think I'll go back and settle that storekeeper." Laputa shook his head. "Will you be serious and hear me? We have no time to knife harmless fools. Before we start for Ntaba Kaikonjwa, I must have from you the figures of the arming in the south. That is the one thing which remains to be settled. I am certain these figures would have been most interesting, but I never heard them. My feet were getting cramped with standing on the bricks, and I inadvertently moved them. The bricks came down with a rattle, and unfortunately, in slipping, I clutched at the trap. This was too much for my frail prop, and the door slammed down with a great noise. Here was a nice business for the eavesdropper. I scurried along the passage as stealthily as I could, and clambered back into the store, while I heard the sound of Laputa and Henriques ferreting among the barrels. I managed to throttle Colin and prevent him barking, but I could not get the confounded trap to close behind me. Something had jammed in it, and it remained half a foot open. I heard the two approaching the door, and I did the best thing that occurred to me. I pulled Colin over the trap, rolled on the top of him, and began to snore heavily as if in a drunken slumber. The key was turned and the gleam of a lantern was thrown on the wall. It flew up and down as its bearer cast the light into the corners. "By God, he's gone," I heard Henriques say. "The swine was listening, and he has bolted now." "He won't bolt far," Laputa said. "He is here. He is snoring behind the counter." These were anxious moments for me. I had a firm grip on Colin's throat, but now and then a growl escaped, which was fortunately blended with my snores. I felt that a lantern was flashed on me, and that the two men were peering down at the heap on the half-opened trap. I think that was the worst minute I ever spent, for, as I have said, my courage was not so bad in action, but in a passive game it oozed out of my fingers. "He is safe enough," Laputa said, after what seemed to me an eternity. "The noise was only the rats among the barrels." I thanked my Maker that they had not noticed the other trap door. "All the same, I think I'll make him safer," said Henriques. Laputa seemed to have caught him by the arm. "Come back and get to business," he said. "I've told you I'll have no more murder. You will do as I tell you, Mr. Henriques." I did not catch the answer, but the two went out and locked the door. I patted the outraged Colin and got to my feet with an aching side where the confounded lid of the trap had been pressing. There was no time to lose, for the two in the outhouse would soon be setting out, and I must be before them. With no better light than a ray of the moon through the window, I wrote a message on a leaf from my pocketbook. I told of the plans I had overheard, and especially I mentioned Dupree's Drift on the Letaba. I added that I was going to the Rooirand to find the secret of the cave, and in one final sentence implored Arcoll to do justice on the Portugoose. That was all, for I had no time for more. I carefully tied the paper with string below the collar of the dog. Then very quietly I went into the bedroom next door, the side of the store farthest from the outhouse. The place was flooded with moonlight, and the window stood open, as I had left it in the afternoon. As softly as I could, I swung Colin over the sill and clambered after him. In my haste, I left my coat behind me, with my pistol in the pocket. Now came a check. My horse was stabled in the shed, and that was close to the outhouse. The sound of leading him out would most certainly bring Laputa and Henriques to the door. In that moment I all but changed my plans. I thought of slipping back to the outhouse and trying to shoot the two men as they came forth. But I reflected that, before I could get them both, one or other would probably shoot me. Besides, I had a queer sort of compunction about killing Laputa. I understood now why Arcoll had stayed his hand from murder, and I was beginning to be of his opinion on our arch enemy. Then I remembered the horses tied up in the bush. One of them I could get with perfect safety. I ran around the end of the store and into the thicket, keeping on soft grass to dull my tread. There, tied up to a marula tree, were two of the finest beasts I had seen in Africa. I selected the better, an African stallion of the Blauw Schimmel, or Blue Roan type, which is famous for speed and endurance. Slipping his bridle from the branch, I led him a little way into the bush in the direction of the Rooirand. Then I spoke to Colin. "Home with you," I said. "Home, old man, as if you were running down a tsessebe." The dog seemed puzzled. "Home," I said again, pointing west in the direction of the Berg. "Home, you brute." And then he understood. He gave one low whine, and cast a reproachful eye on me and the Blue Roan. Then he turned, and with his head down set off with great lopes on the track of the road I had ridden in the morning. A second later, and I was in the saddle, riding hell for leather for the north. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Prester John. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prester John by John Buchan. Chapter 10. I Go Treasure Hunting. For a mile or so I kept the bush, which was open and easy to ride through, and then turned into the path. The moon was high, and the world was all a dim green, with all the track a golden ivory band before me. I had looked at my watch before I started, and seen that it was just after 8 o'clock. I had a great horse under me, and less than 50 miles to cover. Midnight should see me at the cave. With the password I would gain admittance, and there would wait for Laputa and Henriques. Then, if my luck held, I should see the inner workings of the mystery which had puzzled me ever since the Kirkcaple shore. No doubt I should be roughly treated, tied up prisoner, and carried with the army when the march began, but till Inanda's Kraal my life was safe, and before that came the ford of the Letaba. Colin would carry my message to Arcoll, and at the Drift the tables would be turned on Laputa's men. Looking back in cold blood, it seems the craziest chain of accidents to count on for preservation. A dozen possibilities might have shattered any link of it. The password might be wrong, or I might never get the length of those who knew it. The men in the cave might butcher me out of hand, or Laputa might think my behaviour a sufficient warrant for a breach of the solemnest vow. Colin might never get to Blaauwildebeestefontein. Laputa might change his route of march, or Arcoll's men might fail to hold the Drift. Indeed, the other day at Portincross, I was so overcome by the recollection of the perils I had dared, and God's goodness towards me, that I built a new hall for the parish kirk as a token of gratitude. Fortunately for mankind, the brain in a life of action turns more to the matter in hand than to conjuring up the chances of the future. Certainly it was in no discomfort of mind that I swung along the moonlit path to the north. Truth to tell, I was almost happy. The first honours in the game had fallen to me. I knew more about Laputa than any man living, save Henriques. I had my finger on the central pulse of the rebellion. There was hidden treasure ahead of me, a great necklace of rubies, Henriques had said. Nay, there must be more, I argued. This cave of the Rooirand was the headquarters of the Rising, and there must be stored their funds, diamonds, and the gold that they had been bartered for. I believe that every man has deep in his soul a passion for treasure hunting, which will often drive a coward into prodigies of valour. I lusted for that treasure of jewels and gold. Once I had been high-minded and thought of my duty to my country, but in that night ride I fear that what I thought of was my duty to enrich David Crawford. One other purpose simmered in my head. I was devoured with wrath against Henriques. Indeed, I think that was the strongest motive for my escapade, for even before I heard Laputa tell of the vows and the purification, I had it in my mind to go at all costs to the cave. I am a peaceable man at most times, but I think I would rather have had the Portugoose throat in my hands than the collar of Prester John. But behind my thoughts was one master feeling, that Providence had given me my chance, and I must make the most of it. Perhaps the Calvinism of my father's preaching had unconsciously taken grip of my soul. At any rate, I was a fatalist in creed, believing that what was willed would happen, and that man was but a puppet in the hands of his Maker. I looked on the last months as a clear course which had been mapped out for me. Not for nothing had I been given a clue to the strange events which were coming. It was foreordained that I should go alone to Umvelos', and in the promptings of my own fallible heart I believed I saw the workings of Omnipotence. Such is our mortal arrogance, and yet without such a belief I think that mankind would have ever been content to bide sluggishly at home. I passed the spot where on my former journey I had met the horses, and knew that I had covered more than half the road. My ear had been alert for the sound of pursuit, but the bush was quiet as the grave. The man who rode my pony would find him a slow traveller, and I pitied the poor beast bucketed along by an angry rider. Gradually a hazy wall of purple began to shimmer before me, apparently very far off. I knew the ramparts of the Rooirand, and let my schimmel feel my knees in his ribs. Within an hour I should be at the cliff's foot. I had trusted for safety to the password, but as it turned out I owed my life mainly to my horse. For a mile or so from the cliffs I came to the fringes of a great army. The bush was teeming with men, and I saw horses picketed in bunches and a multitude of Cape carts and light wagons. It was like a colossal gathering for Nachtmaal at a Dutch dorp, but every man was black. I saw through a corner of my eye that they were armed with guns, though many carried in addition their spears and shields. Their first impulse was to stop me. I saw guns fly to shoulders and a rush towards the path. The boldest game was the safest, so I dug my heels into the schimmel and shouted for a passage. "Make way," I cried in Kaffir. "I bear a message from the Inkulu. Clear out, you dogs." They recognized the horse, and fell back with a salute. Had I but known it, the beast was famed from the Zambesi to the Cape. It was their king's own charger I rode, and who dared question such a warrant? I heard the word pass through the bush, and all down the road I got the salute. In that moment I fervently thanked my stars that I had got away first, for there would have been no coming second for me. At the cliff foot I found a double line of warriors, who had the appearance of a royal guard, for all were tall men with leopard skin cloaks. Their rifle barrels glinted in the moonlight, and the sight sent a cold shiver down my back. Above them, among the scrub and along the lower slopes of the kranzes, I could see further lines with the same gleaming weapons. The place of the Snake was in strong hands that night. I dismounted and called for a man to take my horse. Two of the guards stepped forward in silence and took the bridle. This left the track to the cave open, and with as stiff a back as I could command, but a sadly fluttering heart, I marched through the ranks. The path was lined with guards, all silent and rigid as graven images. As I stumbled over the stones I felt that my appearance scarcely fitted the dignity of a royal messenger. Among those splendid men at arms I shambled along in old breeches and leggings, hatless, with a dirty face, dishevelled hair, and a torn flannel shirt. My mind was no better than my body, for now that I had arrived I found my courage gone. Had it been possible, I would have turned tail and fled, but the boats were burned behind me and I had no choice. I cursed my rash folly and wondered at my exhilaration of an hour ago. I was going into the black mysterious darkness, peopled by 10,000 cruel foes. My knees rubbed against each other, and I thought that no man had ever been in more deadly danger. At the entrance to the gorge the guards ceased, and I went on alone. Here there was no moonlight, and I had to feel my way by the sides. I moved very slowly, wondering how soon I should find the end my folly demanded. The heat of the ride had gone, and I remember feeling my shirt hang clammily on my shoulders. Suddenly a hand was laid on my breast, and a voice demanded the word. "Emmanuel," I said hoarsely. Then unseen hands took both my arms, and I was led farther into the darkness. My hopes revived for a second. The password had proved true, and at any rate I should enter the cave. In the darkness I could see nothing, but I judged that we stopped before the stone slab which, as I remembered, filled the extreme end of the gorge. My guide did something with the right-hand wall, and I felt myself being drawn into a kind of passage. It was so narrow that two could not go abreast, and so low that the creepers above scraped my hair. Something clicked behind me like the turnstile at the gate of a show. Then we began to ascend steps, still in utter darkness, and a great booming fell on my ear. It was the falling river which had scared me on my former visit, and I marvelled that I had not heard it sooner. Presently we came out into a gleam of moonlight, and I saw that we were inside the gorge and far above the slab. We followed a narrow shelf on its left side, or true right as mountaineers would call it, until we could go no farther. Then we did a terrible thing. Across the gorge, which here was at its narrowest, stretched a slab of stone. Far, far below I caught the moonlight on a mass of hurrying waters. This was our bridge, and though I have a good head for crags, I confess I grew dizzy as we turned to cross it. Perhaps it was broader than it looked. At any rate my guides seemed to have no fear and strode across it as if it were a highway, while I followed in a sweat of fright. Once on the other side, I was handed over to a second pair of guides, who led me down a high passage running into the heart of the mountain. The boom of the river sank and rose as the passage twined. Soon I saw a gleam of light ahead, which was not the moon. It grew larger until suddenly the roof rose, and I found myself in a gigantic chamber. So high it was that I could not make out anything of the roof, though the place was brightly lit with torches stuck round the wall, and a great fire which burned at the farther end. But the wonder was on the left side, where the floor ceased in a chasm. The left wall was one sheet of water, where the river fell from the heights into the infinite depth below. The torches in the fire made the sheer stream glow and sparkle like the battlements of the heavenly city. I have never seen any sight so beautiful or so strange, and for a second my breath stopped in admiration. There were 200 men or more in the chamber, but so huge was the place that they seemed only a little company. They sat on the ground in a circle, with their eyes fixed on the fire and on a figure which stood before it. The glow revealed the old man I had seen on that morning a month before, moving towards the cave. He stood as if in a trance, straight as a tree, with his arms crossed on his breast. A robe of some shining white stuff fell from his shoulders, and was clasped round his middle by a broad circle of gold. His head was shaven, and on his forehead was bound a disc of carved gold. I saw from his gaze that his old eyes were blind. "Who comes?" he asked as I entered. "A messenger from the Inkulu," I spoke up boldly. "He follows soon with the white man, Henriques." Then I sat down in the back row of the circle to await events. I noticed that my neighbour was the fellow 'Mwanga whom I had kicked out of the store. Happily I was so dusty that he could scarcely recognize me, but I kept my face turned away from him. What with the light and warmth, the drone of the water, the silence of the folk, and my mental and physical stress, I grew drowsy and all but slept. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Prester John. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Prester John by John Buchan. Chapter 11. The Cave of the Rooirand. I was roused by a sudden movement. The whole assembly stood up, and each man clapped his right hand to his brow and then raised it high. A low murmur of Inkulu rose above the din of the water. Laputa strode down the hall, with Henriques limping behind him. They certainly did not suspect my presence in the cave, nor did Laputa show any ruffling of his calm. Only Henriques looked weary and cross. I guessed that he had had to ride my pony. The old man, whom I took to be the priest, advanced towards Laputa with his hands raised over his head. A pace before they met he halted, and Laputa went on his knees before him. He placed his hands on his head, and spoke some words which I could not understand. It reminded me, so queer are the tricks of memory, of an old Sabbath school book I used to have, which had a picture of Samuel ordaining Saul as king of Israel. I think I had forgotten my own peril, and was enthralled by the majesty of the place, the wavering torches, the dropping wall of green water. Above all, the figures of Laputa and the keeper of the snake, who seemed to have stepped out of an antique world. Laputa stripped off his leopard skin till he stood stark, a noble form of a man. Then the priest sprinkled some herbs on the fire, and a thin smoke rose to the roof. The smell was that I had smelled on the Kirkcaple shore, sweet, sharp, and strange enough to chill the marrow. And round the fire went the priest in widening and contracting circles, just as on that Sabbath evening in spring. Once more we were sitting on the ground, all except Laputa and the keeper. Henriques was squatting in the front row, a tiny creature among so many burly savages. Laputa stood with bent head in the centre. Then a song began, a wild incantation in which all joined. The old priest would speak some words, and the reply came in barbaric music. The words meant nothing to me. They must have been in some tongue long since dead. But the music told its own tale. It spoke of old kings and great battles, of splendid palaces and strong battlements, of queens white as ivory, of death and life, love and hate, joy and sorrow. It spoke, too, of desperate things, mysteries of horror long shut to the world. No Kaffir ever forged that ritual. It must have come straight from Prester John, or Sheba's queen, or whoever ruled in Africa when time was young. I was horribly impressed. Devouring curiosity and a lurking nameless fear filled my mind. My old dread had gone. I was not afraid now of Kaffir guns, but of the black magic of which Laputa had the key. The incantation died away, but still herbs were flung on the fire till the smoke rose in a great cloud, through which the priest loomed misty and huge. Out of the smoke wreaths his voice came high and strange. It was as if some treble stop had been opened in a great organ, as against the bass drone of the cataract. He was asking Laputa questions, to which came answers in that rich voice which on board the liner had preached the gospel of Christ. The tongue I did not know, and I doubted my neighbours were in better case. It must have been some old sacred language, Phoenician, Sabaean, I know not what, which had survived in the rite of the snake. Then came silence while the fire died down and the smoke eddied away in wreaths towards the river. The priest's lips moved as if in prayer. Of Laputa I saw only the back, and his head was bared. Suddenly a rapt cry broke from the keeper. "God has spoken," he cried. "The path is clear. The snake returns to the house of its birth." An attendant led forward a black goat, which bleated feebly. With a huge antique knife the old man slit its throat, catching the blood in a stone ewer. Some was flung on the fire, which had burned small and low. "Even so," cried the priest, "will the king quench in blood the hearth fires of his foes." Then on Laputa's forehead and bare breast he drew a bloody cross. "I seal thee," said the voice, "priest and king of God's people." The ewer was carried round the assembly, and each dipped his finger in it and marked his forehead. I got a dab to add to the other marks on my face. "Priest and king of God's people," said the voice again, "I call thee to the inheritance of John." Priest and king was he, King of kings, Lord of hosts, Master of the earth. When he ascended on high, he left to his son the sacred snake, the ark of his valour, to be God's dower and pledge to the people whom he has chosen. I could not make out what followed. It seemed to be a long roll of the kings who had borne the snake. None of them I knew, but at the end I thought I caught the name of Shaka the Terrible, and I remembered Arcoll's tale. The keeper held in his arms a box of curiously wrought ivory, about 2 feet long and 1 broad. He was standing beyond the ashes from which, in spite of the blood, thin streams of smoke still ascended. He opened it and drew out something which swung from his hand like a cascade of red fire. "Behold the snake!" cried the keeper, and every man in the assembly, excepting Laputa and including me, bowed his head to the ground and cried, "Oh!" "Ye who have seen the snake," came the voice, "on you is the vow of silence and peace. No blood shall ye shed, of man or beast. No flesh shall ye eat, till the vow is taken from you. From the hour of midnight till sunrise on the second day ye are bound to God. Whoever shall break the vow, on him shall the curse fall. His blood shall dry in his veins, and his flesh shrink on his bones. He shall be an outlaw and accursed, and there shall follow him through life and death the avengers of the snake. Choose ye, my people. Upon you is the vow." By this time we were all flat on our faces, and a great cry of assent went up. I lifted my head as much as I dared to see what would happen next. The priest raised the great necklace till it shone above his head like a halo of blood. I have never seen such a jewel, and I think there has never been another such on earth. Later I was to have the handling of it, and could examine it closely, though now I had only a glimpse. There were 55 rubies in it, the largest as big as a pigeon's egg, and the least not smaller than my thumbnail. In shape they were oval, cut on both sides en cabochon, and on each certain characters were engraved. No doubt this detracted from their value as gems, yet the characters might have been removed and the stone cut in facets, and these rubies would still have been the noblest in the world. I was no jewel merchant to guess their value, but I knew enough to see that here was wealth beyond human computation. At each end of the string was a great pearl and a golden clasp. The sight absorbed me to the exclusion of all fear. I, David Crawford, 19 years of age, and assistant storekeeper in a backveld dorp, was privileged to see a sight to which no Portuguese adventurer had ever attained. There, floating on the smoke wreaths, was the jewel which may once have burned in Sheba's hair. As the priest held the collar aloft, the assembly rocked with a strange passion. Foreheads were rubbed in the dust, and then adoring eyes would be raised, while a kind of sobbing shook the worshippers. In that moment I learned something of the secret of Africa, of Prester John's empire and Shaka's victories. "In the name of God," came the voice, "I deliver to the heir of John, the snake of John." Laputa took the necklet and twined it in 2 loops round his neck till the clasp hung down over his breast. The position changed. The priest knelt before him and received his hands on his head. Then I knew that, to the confusion of all talk about equality, God has ordained some men to be kings and others to serve. Laputa stood naked as when he was born. The rubies were dulled against the background of his skin, but they still shone with a dusky fire. Above the blood-red collar his face had the passive pride of a Roman emperor. Only his great eyes gloomed and burned as he looked on his followers. "Heir of John," he said, "I stand before you as priest and king. My kingship is for the morrow. Now I am the priest to make intercession for my people." He prayed as I never heard man pray before, and to the God of Israel. It was no heathen fetish he was invoking, but the God of whom he had often preached in Christian kirks. I recognized texts from Isaiah and the Psalms and the Gospels, and very especially from the 2 last chapters of Revelation. He pled with God to forget the sins of his people, to recall the bondage of Zion. It was amazing to hear these bloodthirsty savages consecrated by their leader to the meek service of Christ. An enthusiast may deceive himself, and I did not question his sincerity. I knew his heart, black with all the lusts of paganism. I knew that his purpose was to deluge the land with blood. But I knew also that in his eyes his mission was divine, and that he felt behind him all the armies of heaven. "Thou hast been a strength to the poor," said the voice, "a refuge from the storm, a shadow from the heat. When the blast of the terrible ones is as a storm against a wall, thou shalt bring down the noise of strangers, as the heat in dry places. The branch of the terrible ones shall be brought low. And in this mountain shall the Lord of hosts make unto all people a feast of fat things, a feast of wine on the lees, of fat things full of marrow. And he will destroy in this mountain the face of the covering cast over all people, and the veil that is brought over all nations. And the rebuke of his people shall he take away from off all the earth, for the Lord hath spoken it." I listened spellbound as he prayed. I heard the phrases familiar to me in my school days at Kirkcaple. He had some of the tones of my father's voice, and when I shut my eyes I could have believed myself a child again. So much he had got from his apprenticeship to the ministry. I wondered vaguely what the good folks who had listened to him in churches and halls at home would think of him now. But there was in the prayer more than the supplications of the quondam preacher. There was a tone of arrogant pride, the pride of a man to whom the Almighty is only another and greater Lord of hosts. He prayed less as a suppliant than as an ally. A strange emotion tingled in my blood, half awe, half sympathy. As I have said, I understood that there are men born to kingship." He ceased with a benediction. Then he put on the leopard skin cloak and kilt, and received from the kneeling chief a spear and shield. Now he was more king than priest, more barbarian than Christian. It was as a king that he now spoke. I had heard him on board the liner, and had thought his voice the most wonderful I had ever listened to. But now, in that great resonant hall, the magic of it was doubled. He played upon the souls of his hearers as on a musical instrument. At will he struck the chords of pride, fury, hate, and mad joy. Now they would be hushed in breathless quiet, and now the place would echo with savage assent. I remember noticing that the face of my neighbour, 'Mwanga, was running with tears. He spoke of the great days of Prester John, and 100 names I had never heard of. He pictured the heroic age of his nation, when every man was a warrior and hunter, and rich kraals stood in the spots now desecrated by the white man, and cattle wandered on 1,000 hills. Then he told tales of white infamy, lands snatched from their rightful possessors, unjust laws which forced the Ethiopian to the bondage of a despised caste, the finger of scorn everywhere, and the mocking word. If it be the part of an orator to rouse the passion of his hearers, Laputa was the greatest on earth. "What have ye gained from the white man?" he cried. "A bastard civilization which has sapped your manhood, a false religion which would rivet on you the chains of the slave. Ye, the old masters of the land, are now the servants of the oppressor, and yet the oppressors are few, and the fear of you is in their hearts. They feast in their great cities, but they see the writing on the wall, and their eyes are anxiously turning lest the enemy be at their gates." I cannot hope in my prosaic words to reproduce that amazing discourse. Phrases which the hearers had heard at mission schools now suddenly appeared, not as the white man's learning, but as God's message to his own. Laputa fitted the key to the cipher, and the meaning was clear. He concluded, I remember, with a picture of the overthrow of the alien and the golden age which should dawn for the oppressed. Another Ethiopian empire should arise, so majestic that the white man everywhere would dread its name, so righteous that all men under it would live in ease and peace. By rights, I suppose my blood should have been boiling at this treason. I am ashamed to confess that it did nothing of the sort. My mind was mesmerized by this amazing man. I could not refrain from shouting with the rest. Indeed, I was a convert, if there can be conversion when the emotions are dominant and there is no assent from the brain. I had a mad desire to be of Laputa's party, or rather I longed for a leader who should master me and make my soul his own as this man mastered his followers. I have already said that I might have made a good subaltern soldier, and the proof is that I longed for such a general. As the voice ceased there was a deep silence. The hearers were in a sort of trance, their eyes fixed glassily on Laputa's face. It was the quiet of tense nerves and imagination at white heat. I had to struggle with a spell which gripped me equally with the wildest savage. I forced myself to look round at the strained faces, the wall of the cascade, the line of torches. It was the sight of Henriques that broke the charm. Here was one who had no part in the emotion. I caught his eye fixed on the rubies, and in it I read only a devouring greed. It flashed through my mind that Laputa had a foe in his own camp, and the Prester's scholar a votary whose passion was not that of worship. The next thing I remember was a movement among the first ranks. The chiefs were swearing fealty. Laputa took off the collar and called God to witness that it should never again encircle his neck till he had led his people to victory. Then one by one the great chiefs and indunas advanced and swore allegiance with their foreheads on the ivory box. Such a collection of races has never been seen. There were tall Zulus and Swazis with ring cups and feather headdresses. There were men from the north with heavy brass collars and anklets, men with quills in their ears, and earrings and nose rings, shaven heads and heads with wonderfully twisted hair, bodies naked or all but naked, and bodies adorned with skins and necklets. Some were light in colour and some were black as coal. Some had squat negro features and some thin, high-boned Arab faces. But in all there was the air of mad enthusiasm. For a day they were forsworn from blood, but their wild eyes and twitching hands told their future purpose. For an hour or two I had been living in a dream world. Suddenly my absorption was shattered, for I saw that my time to swear was coming. I sat in the extreme back row, at the end nearest the entrance, and therefore I should naturally be the last to go forward. The crisis was near when I should be discovered, for there was no question of my shirking the oath. Then for the first time since I entered the cave, I realized the frightful danger in which I stood. My mind had been strung so high by the ritual that I had forgotten all else. Now came the rebound, and with shaky nerves I had to face discovery and certain punishment. In that moment I suffered the worst terror of my life. There was much to come later, but by that time my senses were dulled. Now they had been sharpened by what I had seen and heard. My nerves were already quivering and my fancy on fire. I felt every limb shaking as 'Mwanga went forward. The cave swam before my eyes. Heads were multiplied giddily, and I was only dimly conscious when he rose to return. Nothing would have made me advance had I not feared Laputa less than my neighbours. They might rend me to pieces, but to him the oath was inviolable. I staggered crazily to my feet and shambled forwards. My eye was fixed on the ivory box, and it seemed to dance before me and retreat. Suddenly I heard a voice, the voice of Henriques, cry, "By God, a spy!" I felt my throat caught, but I was beyond resisting. It was released and I was pinned by the arms. I must have stood vacantly with a foolish smile, while unchained fury raged round me. I seemed to hear Laputa's voice saying, "It is the storekeeper." His face was all that I could see, and it was unperturbed. There was a mocking ghost of a smile about his lips. Myriad hands seemed to grip me and crush my breath, but above the clamour I heard a fierce word of command. After that I fainted. End of chapter 11.